Mist drifted through the firs in languid skeins, softening every branch and hush-worn path that wound toward the old courthouse on the ridge. Once a fashionable spa, the stone villa now stood empty, shutters drawn like sleeping eyelids, its mineral springs long cool. Tonight the air tasted faintly of pine resin and distant thunder, though no storm threatened. A single lantern bobbed along the track, carried by Matthias Engel, a translator sent to examine trunks of correspondence left behind by the last proprietor. His coat gathered droplets of mist as he climbed, yet the quiet held him lightly as if the forest itself wished him gentle passage. At the wrought iron gate the hinges sighed, then accepted his push without protest. Ivy shivered across the rails, releasing the scent of damp earth. Inside the courtyard, gravel crunched underfoot in a rhythm that matched the faraway clock. 4 steps, a pause, another 4. Windows above showed neither candle nor reflection, yet Matthias imagined someone observing, not with eyes, but with the slow, patient awareness of a place remembering its purpose. He placed his lantern on the veranda rail, withdrew the brass key entrusted to him, and unlocked the oak doors. The entrance hall greeted him with cool, mineral air, like the echo of bygone baths. Long mirrors lined the walls, their silvering clouded to soft pewter. Between them hung pastel murals depicting mountain springs, each scene framed by curling acanthus leaves. Colors, though faded, still carried a quiet glow. On the mosaic floor a map of the region spread underfoot, its river tiles glinting whenever the lantern swung. Matthias paused, letting the Kelbach stream at his boot-side glimmer blue for a heartbeat before continuing toward the writing room indicated on his instructions. The room waited at the far end of a corridor, door ajar. Shelves embraced 3 walls. On the 4th, tall windows overlooked the valley, panes fogged by the night mist. A mahogany desk, polished to a muted sheen, held a single oil lamp already lit. Matthias frowned gently. No caretaker was scheduled for another day, but he felt no alarm. The flame wavered once, then steadied, bright enough to read without harshness. Beside the lamp rested a wooden crate filled with letters, each envelope edged in pale green. The topmost bore no address, only a wax seal impressed with a tiny water droplet. He opened it with careful fingers. Inside lay a folded sheet and 3 words in delicate script: "Wait for silence." Nothing more. He set the note aside, removed his notebook, and began cataloging dates and handwritings. French, Hungarian, occasionally archaic German, each mentioning the listening spring in passing, as though all correspondence took the phrase for granted. Outside, the village clock chimed again, 9:30, its tone softened by distance and woodlands. As the last vibration faded, something within the villa answered, a faint gurgle like water shifting through hidden pipes. The sound traveled under the floorboards, paused beneath the writing room, then hushed. Matthias inclined his head, recognizing a pattern akin to breath. Inhale, hold, exhale. He remembered the note's instruction and set his pen down. He closed his eyes. The villa's hush deepened, settling around him like wool. Somewhere in that woven quiet he discerned a whisper, too low for words, but shaped like language nonetheless. It moved through the shelves, brushed the lamp glass, glided along the ceiling moldings, then found rest at the desk's edge. When he opened his eyes, a fresh envelope lay atop the crate. Wax still gleamed liquid. He opened it. This time, the paper held a short passage in fluid French. Consult the map beneath the mirror when the spring speaks twice. Beneath the text, someone had drawn a simple symbol, a circle split by a wavy line. Matthias turned the page. The reverse was blank but faintly damp, as though dipped in cool water seconds before. He slipped the note into his pocket. The hallway mirrors awaited, surfaces smudged by decades. He approached the largest, lantern lifted. Beneath its frame, just visible through a film of dust, lay a hinged panel no broader than a palm. He pressed gently. The panel slid aside to reveal a recessed niche containing a folded cloth map. Its linen surface felt chilled, almost freshly laundered, though the ink bore a century-old hand. The wavy line bisected the central circle, identical to the symbol on the note. At its center a dot glowed faintly, phosphorescent paint, still alive after so long. As Matthias studied the mark, the water gurgle returned, two gentle surges rising from the floorboards as if the house were clearing its throat. He pictured subterranean channels, springs still pulsing beneath stone and tile, keeping faith with their origins. According to the map, a staircase at corridor's end led downward to a small pool once reserved for hydrotherapy. Lantern held steady, he followed. The stairs descended in even spirals, walls cool and damp. At the bottom a vaulted chamber opened, lit by neither lamp nor window, yet possessing a tender glow from mineral veins within the stone. In its center lay a circular basin of milky quartz, water rippling though no pipe discharged. The surface quivered as he approached, sending rings outward in courteous greeting. He knelt, hearing again that soft, near-speech cadence, a consonant of water, a vowel of air. Remembering childhood folklore, he whispered a simple salutation. The ripples slowed. Within their concentric echoes he glimpsed reflections, not of himself but of long-ago bathers easing into the same pool, their faces peaceful, listening. The image faded, leaving ordinary water awaiting the next ripple. Matthias dipped a fingertip. The temperature proved neither cold nor warm, but precisely like human skin, erasing boundary between observer and source. He returned upstairs carrying only the memory of that touch. The writing room remained unchanged save for one detail. The oil lamp, nearly spent, cast a dimmer halo. On the desk lay a final envelope. He opened it to find a line in English this time, printed rather than written. Catalog complete when the listener is heard. Beneath, a drop of quartz dust glimmered, echo of the basin below. Matthias packed the letters carefully, noting their order, then extinguished the lamp. As darkness settled, the villa sighed, satisfied. He stepped onto the veranda. Dawn's first gray hinted behind the pines, and the air, though unmoving, carried the faintest murmur, two pulses of the hidden spring, answering one another beneath layers of earth and time. He closed the gate without hurry, lantern now dark. In the valley, the village clock marked 6 o'clock, each chime tempered by morning mist. Between the strokes lay wide, lucid quiet, reminding him of the basin's calm skin. He walked downhill, heart eased into that cadence. Behind him the courthouse waited, listening still, its limitless correspondence at last entrusted to someone who understood that some archives speak not in words, but in the slow, gentle grammar of water and pause. Savannah summer night breathed gently, perfumed by gardenias and damp brick. Gas lamps flared in measured halos along the quiet paths, lending each cobblestone the hush of a long-kept secret. Across the square rose Whitfield House, an early federal mansion of worn red stucco and green shutters that seldom opened. Its balconies sagged beneath ivy, and its rooms, according to polite rumor, held more echoes than furniture. Nora Whitfield, last of the line, had returned after decades spent cataloging archives for northern universities. The Historical Society now asked her to prepare the family papers for donation. She accepted, half out of duty, half from a mild longing to understand why her grandparents had closed the house so abruptly one humid August and never spoken of it again. The iron gate yielded with a sigh. Crickets stilled as though acknowledging a guest. On the porch, she pressed the tarnished doorbell, knowing no answer would come, then unlocked the double doors herself. Inside, the foyer waited cool and dim. Wallpaper, faded magnolia print, peeled in discreet curls, while a mahogany staircase climbed upward into shadow like a slowed heartbeat. She placed her suitcase beside the hall table and lit a single hurricane lamp she'd brought, its glow floating soft as candle flame. The parlor door stood ajar. Within, silver-framed mirrors rested face down on sideboards, and a grand piano slept beneath a cotton sheet. A faint metallic ticking drifted from somewhere deeper, unhurried, as though measuring not seconds but sighs. She followed it to the rear library. Shelves reached from pine floorboards to ornate crown molding, their volumes cloaked in a whisper of dust. At the room's center, beneath a skylight veiled by cobwebbed lace, sat an octagonal reading table. Upon it rested the source of the ticking, a slim metronome of jasper and brass, its pendulum swaying with mesmeric grace. Yet no one had set it in years. Its key lay untouched beside it. The beat was slow, perhaps 40 per minute, pausing almost imperceptibly at each arc's end, as though deciding whether to continue. Nora set her lamp down and watched 2 full cycles, feeling her pulse slip into step. A faint breeze sighed through the cracked window frame, rustling pages of a ledger that lay open near the metronome. In careful, looping hand it recorded sentences, each on its own line. 8:04 garden gate clicks. 8:07 fountain recedes. 8:10 clock resumes voice. The last entry bore tonight's date, though no one but Nora had crossed the threshold. She gently touched the page. The ink was still damp. Outside the library, a corridor led toward a conservatory added during the 1890s. She remembered vague childhood tales of orchids blooming there through Christmas. Moving with measured calm, she opened the glass door. Warm night air met her, fragrant with something faintly citrus though she saw no trees. Moonlight, sifted through dusty panes, dappled the tiled floor in pale lozenges. Between empty planter boxes stood a wrought iron music stand, its sheet holder bare, yet small clothespins remained as if awaiting a score. As she lingered, the metronome's beat reached faintly through the doorway. Tick, pause, tock, pause, blending with distant fountain hush from the square. She sensed a subtle consonance. The beat aligned with the fountain's spurts, 2 slow pulses followed by a weary hush of water landing. Childhood memory flickered, her grandmother guiding her through this very space at dusk, saying only, "Listen for the rests." Back in the library, the metronome continued, but something new had joined its rhythm. The piano in the parlor gave a gentle, damped chord, 3 notes, brushed rather than struck. Linen still covered the instrument. No key was visible. The sound faded like a breath into cotton. Nora neither startled nor hurried. Instead she crossed to the parlor, lifted a corner of the sheet just enough to glimpse ivory. Dust lay undisturbed. She returned to the foyer and the staircase. Each baluster bore a tiny groove near its base, as if rope had once been threaded along the rail. Upstairs, the family bedrooms opened one by one, each preserved in slumber, beds neatly made, windows shuttered. In the nursery at the corridor's end, moonlight spilled through louvers, illuminating a mobile of paper swans. The swans drifted not randomly but in time with the metronome's muted beat below, as though the air itself oscillated. On the nightstand lay a music box shaped like a tulip. Its winder protruded expectantly. Nora turned it half a rotation. Instead of a song, the box produced a measured silence, an almost palpable pause, then a single chime no larger than a raindrop hitting tin. Another pause followed, then a second chime. The sequence mirrored the library's ticking, slow and deliberate. She stopped the winder. The mobile stilled, the unseen piano fell silent. Only the metronome remained steady. A thought arrived quietly. The house was practicing, like an ensemble warming to a composition written entirely in rests and faint entrances. Perhaps her grandparents had not abandoned it but simply stepped back to let the piece play itself to conclusion. Back downstairs she closed the ledger, added 1 new line in pencil. 8:40, listener entered, movement continues. She did not touch the metronome. She left mirrors face down, respecting their chosen hour, and locked the front doors behind her. Crossing the square, she paused by the fountain. Its cascade now seemed closer, no longer distant, and its rhythm aligned exactly with the pulse still audible in her thoughts. Gas lamps hummed. Spanish moss swayed like satin ribbons marking time. Whitfield House rested in shadow, content, it seemed, to continue its nocturne until the right cadence found release. Nora walked on toward the guest house where she would sleep, feeling her own footsteps merge with the slow counting all around. The night, the gardenias, the moss-laden oaks, everything measured breaths between gentle notes. Tomorrow she would begin boxing letters and journals, but tonight she suspected the house required only company, not classification. Behind her, a final chord, soft, gracious, floated from the shuttered mansion, then resolved into quiet. The fountain answered with one heavier splash. Both sounds ebbed, leaving Forsyth Square wrapped in a stillness so complete it felt almost warm, a hush shaped precisely to cradle sleep. Water still clung to stones in small, deliberate beads, but the clouds had emptied themselves, leaving the night clear enough for the moon to slip between fractured ribs of sky. On a low rise above the Atlantic inlet, the former Abbey of Kilfoyle stood in half-shadow, its slate roofs long collapsed, its nave open to weather and wandering cows. Yet one building remained intact. The scriptorium, sealed decades ago when the last monk departed, its oak door barred against storms and curiosity alike. Eamon Daly, temporary archivist for the County Heritage Office, arrived alone at that quiet threshold. The key, posted to him with no covering letter, turned soundlessly as if the lock pivoted on memory rather than metal. He stepped inside, lantern held low. The room breathed a mild, papery scent, vellum, linseed oil, a faint drift of lavender left to discourage bookworms. Shelves lined the walls from flagstones to rafters, laden with volumes whose spines carried neither titles nor dates, only small carved motifs of reeds and spirals. Outside, the tide murmured against the inlet wall, each wave coasting inland, sighing, retreating. Within, a hush took firmer root. Dust motes hung in the lantern's beam, drifting with such slow grace they seemed fixed, tiny constellations stranded between seconds. Eamon paused, coat still damp at the shoulders, and listened for any structural groan, any night creature. Nothing moved but the lantern flame, gently rocking to its own rhythmic breath. His task was simple: create a preliminary inventory, note what might warrant conservation. He began at the nearest shelf, easing a thin codex into the lantern pool. No title, only a single line of neat Gaelic script across the flyleaf. Fan na gawith, the wind's voice. The pages held alternating staves of plainchant and blank-ruled bars. Every so often, a marginal note read, "Leave space for what is not sung." The instruction felt less cryptic than polite. He closed the codex, set it aside, and drew the next. Hours passed without clock or chime, yet he worked unhurriedly, guided by the steadiness of his own pulse and the tide's patient conversation outside. Occasionally a droplet from the leaky roof landed in the far corner, giving a soft tap like a restrained bell. Each impact sounded evenly spaced, though no one could predict the drips. They adhered to a cadence known only to the rafters. Mid-shelf he came upon a volume heavier than its neighbors. Lifting it revealed a recess beneath, a shallow cavity gouged into the stone. Inside lay a rolled parchment tied with twine, surprisingly free of dust. Beside it, a small tin whistle, tarnished but intact, rested upon a folded scrap of linen embroidered with a single question mark. Eamon did not untie the parchment immediately. He examined the whistle first, noting the absence of fingerhole numbers, only faint etchings of tied lines up the stem. After a moment's thought he raised it to his lips and released a tentative breath. No note answered, only the lantern flickered, though the room's air remained still. He tried again, directing air more gently this time. The whistle responded with a tone so soft it registered more in the ribs than the ears, a murmur almost disguised as exhalation. Beneath that near silence, something else stirred. Shelves whispered, a page lifted itself, and the drip in the far corner paused as if recalibrating. Outside, one wave lingered against the wall longer than the rest, then withdrew with measured delicacy. Eamon lowered the whistle. The hush returned, but altered, thicker, purposeful, similar to the way silence deepens in the instant after a church choir folds its last chord into the vault. He untied the parchment. Inside unrolled a map, ink faded to soft rust. It depicted no land or sea, only a series of spirals emanating from a single point marked Endar Am, the second time. Along each spiral arm, neat script repeated 3 words, "Listen between breaths." At the map's center, a modest circle suggested the scriptorium itself. Someone long ago had charted stillness as though it were geography. Eamon set the map upon the desk and placed the whistle in its central circle. He waited, letting his breathing slow until it matched the tide's rhythm. Inflow, pause, outflow, pause. With each inhale, the lantern brightened subtly. With each exhale, its glow softened. After several cycles, the drip resumed, not randomly but in step, a quiet counterbeat. The building, he realized, had accepted the clock of breath. He noted the moment in his ledger, ink strokes unhurried, and carefully re-rolled the map. The whistle he wrapped in the linen question mark, then replaced both in the hollow, returning the heavier volume atop. The drip continued its companionable ticking. Nothing demanded explanation. The materials wished only to be witnessed, not solved. When at last he stepped outside, dawn had crept over the Atlantic, underpainting the clouds with faint apricot. The inlet lay glass still, reflecting the abbey ruins so crisply that pillars seemed to stand upon sky. A heron flapped once, slow and deliberate, before settling among reeds. Eamon extinguished the lantern, feeling the day accept him back. He would file a measured report, manuscript stable, environment cool, further conservation advisable, but somewhere between lines he'd write a private note. Archive holds a silence that keeps its own index. Consultation requires listening, not reading. He would leave the whistle, the map, the cadence of drips untouched. As he walked the sodden lane toward the village, rain began again. Not a downpour, only scattered drops that stitched faint rings into puddles. Between each patter lay space wide enough to imagine a hidden melody. Eamon found himself breathing in time with that pattern, carrying the abbey's gentle charter of pauses with him, content that Kilfoyle would continue its quiet recital for the next attentive ear. Mist drifted through the firs in languid skeins, softening every branch and hush-worn path that wound toward the old courthouse on the ridge. Once a fashionable spa, the stone villa now stood empty, shutters drawn like sleeping eyelids, its mineral springs long cooled. Tonight the air tasted faintly of pine resin and distant thunder, though no storm threatened. A single lantern bobbed along the track, carried by Matthias Engel, a translator sent to examine trunks of correspondence left behind by the last proprietor. His coat gathered droplets of mist as he climbed, yet the quiet held him lightly as if the forest itself wished him gentle passage. At the wrought iron gate the hinges sighed, then accepted his push without protest. Ivy shivered across the rails, releasing the scent of damp earth. Inside the courtyard, gravel crunched underfoot in a rhythm that matched the faraway clock. 4 steps, a pause, another 4. Windows above showed neither candle nor reflection, yet Matthias imagined someone observing, not with eyes, but with the slow, patient awareness of a place remembering its purpose. He placed his lantern on the veranda rail, withdrew the brass key entrusted to him, and unlocked the oak doors. The entrance hall greeted him with cool, mineral air, like the echo of bygone baths. Long mirrors lined the walls, their silvering clouded to soft pewter. Between them hung pastel murals depicting mountain springs, each scene framed by curling acanthus leaves. Colors, though faded, still carried a quiet glow. On the mosaic floor a map of the region spread underfoot, its river tiles glinting whenever the lantern swung. Matthias paused, letting the Kelbach stream at his boot-side glimmer blue for a heartbeat before continuing toward the writing room indicated on his instructions. The room waited at the far end of a corridor, door ajar. Shelves embraced 3 walls. On the 4th, tall windows overlooked the valley, panes fogged by the night mist. A mahogany desk, polished to a muted sheen, held a single oil lamp already lit. Matthias frowned gently. No caretaker was scheduled for another day, but he felt no alarm. The flame wavered once, then steadied, bright enough to read without harshness. Beside the lamp rested a wooden crate filled with letters, each envelope edged in pale green. The topmost bore no address, only a wax seal impressed with a tiny water droplet. He opened it with careful fingers. Inside lay a folded sheet and 3 words in delicate script: "Wait for silence." Nothing more. He set the note aside, removed his notebook, and began cataloging dates and handwritings. French, Hungarian, occasionally archaic German, each mentioning the listening spring in passing, as though all correspondence took the phrase for granted. Outside, the village clock chimed again, 9:30, its tone softened by distance and woodlands. As the last vibration faded, something within the villa answered, a faint gurgle like water shifting through hidden pipes. The sound traveled under the floorboards, paused beneath the writing room, then hushed. Matthias inclined his head, recognizing a pattern akin to breath. Inhale, hold, exhale. He remembered the note's instruction and set his pen down. He closed his eyes. The villa's hush deepened, settling around him like wool. Somewhere in that woven quiet he discerned a whisper, too low for words, but shaped like language nonetheless. It moved through the shelves, brushed the lamp glass, glided along the ceiling moldings, then found rest at the desk's edge. When he opened his eyes, a fresh envelope lay atop the crate. Wax still gleamed liquid. He opened it. This time, the paper held a short passage in fluid French. Consult the map beneath the mirror when the spring speaks twice. Beneath the text, someone had drawn a simple symbol, a circle split by a wavy line. Matthias turned the page. The reverse was blank but faintly damp, as though dipped in cool water seconds before. He slipped the note into his pocket. The hallway mirrors awaited, surfaces smudged by decades. He approached the largest, lantern lifted. Beneath its frame, just visible through a film of dust, lay a hinged panel no broader than a palm. He pressed gently. The panel slid aside to reveal a recessed niche containing a folded cloth map. Its linen surface felt chilled, almost freshly laundered, though the ink bore a century-old hand. The wavy line bisected the central circle, identical to the symbol on the note. At its center a dot glowed faintly, phosphorescent paint, still alive after so long. As Matthias studied the mark, the water gurgle returned, two gentle surges rising from the floorboards as if the house were clearing its throat. He pictured subterranean channels, springs still pulsing beneath stone and tile, keeping faith with their origins. According to the map, a staircase at corridor's end led downward to a small pool once reserved for hydrotherapy. Lantern held steady, he followed. The stairs descended in even spirals, walls cool and damp. At the bottom a vaulted chamber opened, lit by neither lamp nor window, yet possessing a tender glow from mineral veins within the stone. In its center lay a circular basin of milky quartz, water rippling though no pipe discharged. The surface quivered as he approached, sending rings outward in courteous greeting. He knelt, hearing again that soft, near-speech cadence, a consonant of water, a vowel of air. Remembering childhood folklore, he whispered a simple salutation. The ripples slowed. Within their concentric echoes he glimpsed reflections, not of himself but of long-ago bathers easing into the same pool, their faces peaceful, listening. The image faded, leaving ordinary water awaiting the next ripple. Matthias dipped a fingertip. The temperature proved neither cold nor warm, but precisely like human skin, erasing boundary between observer and source. He returned upstairs carrying only the memory of that touch. The writing room remained unchanged save for one detail. The oil lamp, nearly spent, cast a dimmer halo. On the desk lay a final envelope. He opened it to find a line in English this time, printed rather than written. Catalog complete when the listener is heard. Beneath, a drop of quartz dust glimmered, echo of the basin below. Matthias packed the letters carefully, noting their order, then extinguished the lamp. As darkness settled, the villa sighed, satisfied. He stepped onto the veranda. Dawn's first gray hinted behind the pines, and the air, though unmoving, carried the faintest murmur, two pulses of the hidden spring, answering one another beneath layers of earth and time. He closed the gate without hurry, lantern now dark. In the valley, the village clock marked 6 o'clock, each chime tempered by morning mist. Between the strokes lay wide, lucid quiet, reminding him of the basin's calm skin. He walked downhill, heart eased into that cadence. Behind him the courthouse waited, listening still, its limitless correspondence at last entrusted to someone who understood that some archives speak not in words, but in the slow, gentle grammar of water and pause. Fog drifted from the river like pale silk, pouring between hedgerows and creeping up the wide stone steps, as though intent on entering with the arriving dusk. The ancient manor, tucked into the Welsh borderlands, had always seemed to breathe in rhythm with the weather, exhaling faint drafts through keyholes and floorboards. Tonight, its windows glowed a muted amber, and the faint silhouette of a woman could be glimpsed in the upper corridor, pausing, listening, then moving on. No carriage wheels rattled along the lane, no birds called from the bare oaks. All was folded into a gentle quiet, poised delicately on the edge of sleep. Madame Rowena Price, recent inheritor of the estate, had returned after years abroad. Her companions whispered that she walked as though memories brushed her sleeves, pausing to touch banisters or fading tapestries the way some stroked the rim of a half-remembered tune. She gave few instructions to the small staff, only that fires be kept low and lanterns shaded. Even the clock in the music room had been wound down to silence. At nightfall, she asked the housemaid, Ellen, to leave the gallery doors ajar so that any sound drifting from the old wing might find its way out, like a caged bird seeking the night. Ellen herself had grown within earshot of local legends. As a child she was told that GWRDD Hall had once been a refuge for Jacobite sympathizers, that its library concealed a hidden stair to the river. Yet those tales felt distant compared to the softer things she sensed now. A faint smell of violets where none were kept, a low creak in the study at the same hour each evening. Rowena seemed to court such murmurs, wandering the halls long after candles should be doused, pausing at locked doors as though deciding whether to knock. On this particular night, snow began to fall, small, soundless crystals that thickened the air. Ellen stood at the kitchen window, palm warming the glass, and watched the yard fade to pearl. She wondered whether the snow would muffle the night's expected footfalls or make them sharper. Upstairs, Rowena's slippered steps crossed and recrossed the long gallery, tracing its length with unhurried grace. From below, the pattern felt almost like a lullaby. 12 measured strides, a pause, the subtle turn, 12 strides back again. Every so often, the hush deepened as if the house exhaled relief. At the stroke of 10 by Ellen's wristwatch, since the music room clock lay dormant, a barely audible thud came from the north wing. Rowena's pacing stopped. Ellen raised her head, heart slowing rather than quickening, as though the sound confirmed an expectation. She climbed the servants' stair, each tread cushioned by carpet-worn velvet thin. At the top, she found Rowena framed by the landing window, gaze fixed on the corridor leading to the locked nursery. Snow light silvered her profile, lending her an almost translucent sorrow. "They have arrived," Rowena murmured, not turning. Ellen did not ask who. The words felt like a bell note fading over water, a signal understood without explanation. Together they moved toward the nursery door, its brass handle dulled with age. No key had been found since Rowena's return. Still, the lock slid free at her touch, as though consenting to her presence. Inside, the air held the hush of rooms left intact for decades. A small oak cradle beneath embroidered drapes, a rocking horse frozen mid-prance, a patchwork quilt folded with careful finality. What drew their attention lay upon the windowsill, an envelope the color of old parchment, unmarked and thin. Rowena lifted it carefully, holding it to the lamp. The seal, once crimson, had faded to rusty rose and bore a sigil, a simple sprig of lily of the valley. She did not break it. Instead, she pressed the fragile paper to her heart and closed her eyes. Outside, snowflakes thickened, tapping the glass in patterns that, if one listened long enough, resembled hushed speech. Ellen felt no impulse to intrude. She studied instead the faint impression of footsteps in the room's thin dust, leading from window to cradle, cradle to doorway. They were not hers, nor Rowena's, and their light scuffs suggested slippers rather than boots. The prince paused by the cradle where a small silver rattle had been set upright, faintly tarnished, but gently ringing now under no visible hand. A single note shimmered through the chilly air, then softened into silence again. Rowena addressed the empty cradle with the tender gratitude of a host greeting a late-arriving guest. "You kept your promise," she whispered, words meant for ears unseen. She placed the sealed envelope inside the quilt's folded corner, smoothing fabric as a mother might. The room's temperature seemed to rise by a breath, enough to dispel one's urge to shiver. Even the long idle rocking horse gave a subtle sway, as though nudged by a departing child. They left the nursery door partially open upon exiting. Neither woman felt compelled to speak. Down the corridor, the grandfather clock resumed ticking though no hand had wound it, the pendulum swinging with a calm, measured grace. In that quiet rhythm, Alan sensed the house settling into contented rest, its long-kept secret finally acknowledged rather than solved. Later, Alan lay in her attic chamber beneath the eaves, listening to the snow hush the world outside. She considered the footprints, the letter, the cradle's faint rattle, and realized the mystery comforted rather than troubled her. GWRD Hall seemed less haunted than fulfilled, as though something that had lingered between worlds now found its place in the cadence of night. Rowena, in her own suite, extinguished the last lamp. Before sleep claimed her, she pictured the envelope waiting in the cradle, untouched yet undeniably present, like a final stanza of a lullaby sung across generations. Downstairs, the fire sank to embers, sending a single curl of smoke toward the dark beams overhead. And the valley, wrapped in falling snow, held the manor in its silent embrace, content with secrets that whispered only softly, so softly, in the gentle company of dreams. Every postcard in Millfield's general store showed a town that didn't quite exist. Sarah Chin discovered this during her first week as the town's new librarian. She had stopped at Henderson's general store to buy stamps and noticed the rotating rack of postcards near the register. The images were beautiful. Main Street bathed in golden autumn light, the old covered bridge reflected in still water, children playing in Memorial Park under trees heavy with snow. But something was wrong with each picture. The church steeple was too tall. The bridge had an extra arch. The park contained a gazebo that Sarah had never seen in her daily walks through town. "These are lovely," she told Mrs. Henderson, holding up a card showing the library where she now worked. In the image, the building had ivy climbing its walls and a garden full of flowers that didn't exist in reality. "Oh yes," Mrs. Henderson said, adjusting her reading glasses. "Mr. Garrett paints them himself. Been doing it for 30 years. Comes in every few months with a new batch." Sarah examined the postcard more closely. The signature in the corner read E. Garrett, in small, precise letters. The painting style was realistic but soft, as if viewed through a gentle filter of memory or dream. "Where does he live?" Sarah asked. Mrs. Henderson paused, her hand hovering over the cash register keys. "Well, now that's a good question. Somewhere out past Miller's Creek, I believe. He's not much for socializing." That evening, Sarah walked through town with several postcards in her pocket. She compared each painted scene with reality. The differences were subtle but consistent. Garrett's version of Millfield was prettier, more welcoming. Trees were fuller, buildings better maintained, the sky always touched with the warm light of either sunrise or sunset. Most strangely, the painted streets were populated with people Sarah didn't recognize. A woman in a blue dress walking past the hardware store. Children on bicycles that looked like they belonged to an earlier decade. An elderly man feeding pigeons that gathered around the town fountain. Sarah had lived in small towns before. She knew that in places like Millfield, everyone knew everyone else. But the people in Garrett's postcards were strangers to her. She began asking longtime residents about the postcard painter. The responses were always vague, tinged with the kind of uncertainty that suggested the speakers weren't entirely sure of their own memories. "Oh, Ethan Garrett," said Tom Bradley, who ran the hardware store. "Known him since I was young. Quiet fellow. Keeps to himself mostly." "How long has he been painting postcards?" Tom scratched his chin, considering. "Seems like always. Though now that I think about it, I can't recall when he started exactly." Sarah's curiosity grew. She drove out past Miller's Creek one Saturday morning, following the winding country road that led away from town. The landscape was typical of rural New England, stone walls marking old property lines, maples beginning their autumn transformation, farmhouses set back from the road like quiet secrets. She found no mailbox marked Garrett. No obvious artist studio. Just miles of peaceful countryside that eventually looped back toward Millfield. The mystery deepened when Sarah discovered a box of old postcards in the library's storage room. These were vintage cards from the 1940s and 50s, yellowed with age and postmarked from distant cities. But mixed among them were several cards showing Millfield as painted by E. Garrett. The style was identical to the current postcards, but these showed the town as it had looked decades ago. Sarah held one up to the light. It depicted Main Street with the old elm trees that had been lost to disease in the 1980s. Cars from the 1950s were parked along the curb. A woman in a vintage dress and hat was entering what used to be Woolworth's Five and Dime. But even in these older postcards, there were the same subtle improvements. Buildings appeared freshly painted, gardens bloomed more luxuriously than nature typically allowed, and the people in the scenes possessed a timeless quality that made them seem both specific and universal. Sarah began to form a theory. Perhaps Garrett wasn't just painting Millfield as it was, but as it could be. as it should be. His postcards showed not the actual town, but its potential, the ideal version that existed somewhere between memory and hope. She started visiting the general store regularly, hoping to encounter the mysterious painter. Mrs. Henderson mentioned that he usually came in on Tuesday afternoons, but Sarah's Tuesday visits never coincided with his appearances. One October evening, as Sarah was closing the library, she noticed a figure standing across the street. An elderly man with gray hair and a worn canvas jacket was studying the building intently. In his hand, he held what appeared to be a sketchbook. Sarah stepped outside, but when she looked again, the man was gone. In his place was only the lamppost casting its circle of yellow light on the empty sidewalk. The next week, a new batch of postcards appeared at Henderson's store. Among them was one showing the library on a crisp autumn evening. In the painted scene, warm light spilled from every window, and a figure could be seen in the doorway, a woman with dark hair wearing a red scarf. Sarah recognized herself, but improved somehow. In Garrett's version, she looked more confident, more at home. The library behind her seemed more welcoming, more alive than the sometimes lonely building where she actually worked. She bought the postcard and kept it on her desk. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons when the autumn light slanted through the library windows just right, she would look at the painted version of herself and wonder if Garrett painted not just places but possibilities. Perhaps somewhere in the space between what was and what could be, there existed a town exactly like the one in his postcards. A place where every day held the gentle promise of a perfect afternoon, and every person was the best version of themselves they could imagine being. Evening air lay cool across the green, touching maple leaves with silver. The town's wooden storefronts, painted in subdued pastels, leaned quietly together, and the ivy-clad steeple of St. Anselm's Church lifted into a sky sprinkled with early autumn stars. Against that hush, the tick from the square's cast-iron clock sounded unhurried, as though each second paused to breathe before moving on. Marjorie Hale arrived by bus just as dusk settled. She stepped down with one suitcase, pausing to absorb the stillness she remembered from childhood holidays. Bellevue, she sensed, had grown even gentler in her years away. She had come now, at the Historical Society's request, to catalog the workshop of the late clockmaker, Silas Brandt, whose little shop overlooked the river and the covered bridge. Rumor held that Brandt's final projects remained intact, though no one had entered since the funeral 2 winters past. Marjorie crossed the green, her shoes brushing early fallen leaves that crackled only faintly. Lanterns and wrought iron holders cast soft pools of light. The river, unseen beyond the birches, murmured a steady bedtime note. Passing the square clock, she noticed the minute hand resting between markings, neither on nor between any precise number. The tick followed a beat later, patient, composed. Brandt's shop stood at the river's edge, a 2-story clapboard building with wide, bright windows now dim. A brass plaque beside the door read simply, "Timepieces." No lock barred her entrance. The key had been left under the mat, exactly where the Society's letter said it would be. She turned it in the old latch. The door opened on a breath of cedar shavings and faint machine oil, an aroma she found comforting rather than sharp. Inside, shelves climbed to the tin ceiling, holding clocks of every era. Walnut regulators, delicate French carriage pieces, schoolhouse octagons, and tiny porcelain mantel designs painted with pastoral scenes. Most waited silent, pendulums tied off for rest. Yet a few soft ticks mingled, never in unison, each following a personal rhythm. Against that background a larger sound drifted, low like the settling of wooden beams, coming from the workroom at the rear. Marjorie set down her suitcase, lit the single oil lamp left on the counter, and followed the sound. The hallway felt like an extended exhale, narrow and polished with decades of footsteps. She pushed open the workroom door. The space revealed a long bench crowded by lathes, glass domes, brass gears organized in felt-lined drawers. On the far wall hung a regulator clock unlike any she'd seen. Its dial lacked numbers, showing instead 12 slender hour markers of pale wood, each grain swirling gently in the lamplight. The pendulum, a disc of frosted glass, moved with measured grace. As she watched, the disc paused mid-swing, hovered a heartbeat, then completed the arc. A deliberate linger, not a flaw. Pinned above the bench lay pages of Brandt's precise handwriting. diagrams of wheels whose teeth varied subtly in length, tables noting moonrise, river height, and barometric pressure. One notation recurred, "Allow the rest." She traced the phrase curious. On the bench itself rested a small pocket watch encased in clear quartz rather than metal. Its hands, too, paused between seconds as though reluctant to intrude upon silence. She opened her ledger and began recording. Dimensions, materials, condition. The ticking around her felt almost conversational, taking turns, never competing. When she paused to sip water, she noticed the room's ambient hush had deepened. The regulator's glass pendulum now stood still at center. She held her breath. The next swing resumed only once she exhaled. A coincidence, perhaps, but she tried again. Breath held, pendulum stopped. Breath released, motion returned, slow, elegant, accepting. An old memory stirred. Childhood visits to Brant's shop, the clockmaker kneeling to her eye level, showing her how to anchor a tiny mainspring. He'd spoken of time as kindly if listened to. She felt now that kindness settling like a shawl across her shoulders. At the back of the workroom a narrower door stood slightly ajar. Beyond it, stairs descended toward the river, Brant's finishing loft, she recalled. Lamp in hand she eased down. The river's hush grew clearer, the boards beneath her feet cool with evening damp. The loft opened into a half-moon balcony enclosed by windows. In the center stood a single tall clock, unfinished, its case of pale ash gleaming softly. The dial showed no hands at all, only a circular aperture revealing quiet darkness within. A slender envelope leaned against its base, addressed in Brant's elegant script. For the listener. Marjorie broke the seal. Inside lay one sentence: "Set no hands, the river will mark." Beneath the words, a pencil sketch depicted a line of water flowing through an open circle, ripples aligning with unseen hours. As she lowered the letter, the river outside sent a faint rush, followed by the delicate creak of the balcony's frame. The clock's aperture brightened slightly as though water light reflected through glass. She stepped closer but did not touch. Instead, she listened, past ticking, past wood settling, past her own pulse, until she caught a rhythmic drip, drip, drip. The sound matched no leak. It echoed the regulator's earlier tempo, yet gentler, dissolving between notes. She understood then that the unfinished clock measured passage not by gears, but by the hush between river breaths. It required no winding, only presence. The realization soothed more than it surprised her. Brant had always pursued such quiet fidelities. Marjorie returned upstairs and closed her ledger. Rather than detail every mechanism, she wrote a single observation. The clocks here wait with patience. They keep time for those who listen to pauses. She left the regulator undisturbed, pendulum drifting as if rocked by her departing footsteps. Locking the shop, she paused on the porch. Across the water, the covered bridge glimmered faintly. The square clock's chime sounded, one soft tone, though midnight was minutes away. The note lingered longer than any bell's metal could sustain, then faded into the river's whisper. She walked toward the inn, suitcase gently bumping her knee, mind unburdened by urgency. Behind her, the shop's windows glowed for a fleeting instant, catching lamplight from within. Then darkness folded back over wood and glass. Bellevue streets remained empty. Leaves rustled overhead like mild applause. Marjorie felt that somewhere in the crisp air, seconds chose when to reveal themselves, and she was content to follow their lead. Tonight, and perhaps every night thereafter, the clocks would keep their gentle counsel, and the river would mark the hours in its own uncounted way, guiding the town, and anyone willing to pause, toward a sleep untroubled by exactness. In the narrow streets of Prague's old town, there lived a clockmaker who cast no shadow at noon. Anna Kozlova first noticed this peculiarity on a bright September morning. She was walking to her job at the municipal library when she saw the old man standing outside his shop. The cobblestones were dappled with shadows from the medieval buildings that leaned toward each other like old friends sharing secrets. But where the clockmaker stood, there was only empty sunlight. The shop itself was unremarkable. Tucked between a bakery and a bookbinder, its narrow window displayed pocket watches and mantel clocks that seemed frozen in different moments. Some showed morning hours, others evening. A few had stopped entirely, their hands resting at angles that suggested they had simply grown tired. Anna had lived in Prague all her life, but she had never noticed the clockmaker before. This seemed impossible. His shop sat on a street she walked every day. The sign above the door, painted in faded gold letters, read Hodiny Kesu, Clocks of Time. The lettering looked decades old. She began observing the clockmaker during her lunch breaks. His name, according to the brass nameplate beside his door, was František Novak. He appeared to be in his 70s, with silver hair combed neatly back and hands that moved with the precise delicacy of his trade. He wore the same gray wool vest every day and worked at a bench visible through the shop window. František's customers were few but regular. Anna recognized some of them: the widow from Wenceslas Square who brought him a carriage clock every month, the professor from Charles University who carried pocket watches in various states of repair. They would enter his shop and emerge exactly 1 hour later, regardless of how much work their timepieces required. The mystery of the missing shadow might have remained Anna's private curiosity, except for the morning she saw František's reflection in the bakery window. Or rather, she saw what should have been his reflection. The glass showed only the interior of his shop, as if he were made of air. That evening, Anna stayed late at the library. She researched František Novak in the city records. According to the documents, a clockmaker by that name had operated a shop at that address since 1892. The photograph in the oldest file showed a man who looked exactly like the František she saw every day. Not older, not younger, identical. The next morning, Anna gathered her courage and entered the clockmaker's shop. A small bell chimed as she pushed open the door, and she found herself surrounded by the gentle ticking of dozens of timepieces. The sound was oddly comforting, like a mechanical lullaby. František looked up from his workbench. His eyes were the pale blue of winter sky, and when he smiled, his face creased in patterns that spoke of countless years of concentration. "How may I help you, miss?" His voice carried a slight accent that Anna couldn't place. Check, but from another era. Anna had prepared several excuses for her visit, but standing in the warm light of his shop, she found herself speaking honestly. "I've been watching you work," she said. "You're very skilled." František nodded, returning his attention to the pocket watch in his hands. Its internal mechanisms gleamed like tiny golden flowers. "Time is a delicate thing," he said. "It requires careful tending." Anna wandered the shop, examining the clocks on every surface. Some were clearly antiques, others appeared newly made but in vintage styles. All of them kept different time. "Don't you find it confusing?" she asked. "All these different hours?" František set down his tools and looked at her with those pale eyes. "Time isn't singular, miss. It flows like water, pooling in different places. Some moments last forever. Others pass before we notice them." He stood and moved to a grandfather clock that stood in the corner. Its pendulum swung in a rhythm that seemed to match Anna's heartbeat. "This one," he said, touching the clock's wooden case with reverence, "keeps the time of a woman's first love. Every second stretches like honey." He moved to another clock, this one small and delicate on a shelf. "This counts the minutes of a child's last day with her grandmother. Each tick is precious beyond measure." Anna felt something shift in the shop around them. The ticking seemed to grow more complex, layered, like dozens of hearts beating at once. "And what time do you keep, Mr. Novak?" František returned to his workbench. In the afternoon light streaming through the window, Anna could see through him just slightly, like looking through morning mist. "I keep the time between moments," he said. "The pause between 1 second and the next. It's a very specific time, very necessary, and very lonely." Anna left the shop with more questions than answers, but she returned the next day and the day after. František never seemed surprised to see her. He would smile his gentle smile and continue his work while she browsed among the clocks. Over the weeks, Anna began to understand that František existed in the spaces between things, between shadow and light, between past and present, between the tick and the tock of every clock that measured mortal time. She never asked him directly about his nature. Some mysteries she realized were gifts. They were meant to be experienced rather than explained. Instead, she brought him tea in the afternoons. She listened to his stories about the clocks he tended. And sometimes, when the light was just right and the city was quiet, she thought she could see her own shadow stretched toward him across the shop floor, offering the comfort of ordinary time to someone who existed in the eternal pause between moments. Fog settled over the disused tracks like a memory refusing to fade. Long after passenger trains stopped visiting the Northumberland moorland, the red brick station at Brackenfell remained upright, its iron canopy sheltering silence instead of travelers. A single lane curved past heather slopes, ending at locked gates where an enamel sign, letters worn to pale ghosts, once promised departures every hour. Now only wind and curlews moved with purpose, tracing slow flights across the sky. Amelia Rook arrived one soft April afternoon, seeking a place to finish a book on forgotten railways. She rented the old stationmaster's cottage, a three-room dwelling stitched to the platform by a short covered walkway. The local letting agent spoke kindly yet cautiously. "Keep the main waiting room closed at night," he said. "The echoes there grow restless after dark." Amelia assumed he meant drafts, perhaps the rattle of loose panes, and thanked him without pressing. Her first days passed in gentle routine. Morning light pooled through sash windows, warming chipped tiles that once carried the scuff of eager boots. She brewed nettle tea, walked the platform, and noted how moss filled every groove of the signal lever. Certain evenings she heard distant whistles that could only have belonged to wind cutting through drains, yet they drifted with such measured pitch that she paused, half expecting a locomotive to crest the bend. Near twilight on the seventh day, she unlocked the waiting room. Dust hovered in angled beams, giving the air a weight both delicate and old. Wooden benches lined each wall. At the far end hung a brass echo board, once used by porters to test acoustics before announcements. Its surface, though tarnished, still caught traces of light. Beneath it sat a mahogany ledger stand, empty but for a single fountain pen tethered by chain. Amelia crossed the creaking floor. When she touched the board, vibrations throbbed faintly, as if storing the hum of conversations long finished. She stood back and clapped once. The echo returned not as her own clap but as layered murmurs, snippets of farewells, ticket requests, the polite shuffle of baggage, all softened by time yet unmistakably human. She tried again. This time the echo repeated her clap, ordinary and clear. Puzzled, she left, locked the door and made soup beneath a low moon. That night, rain tapped the slates. Just after midnight, a soft metallic ring sounded from the platform bell beside her cottage. She stepped into waterproof and boots, lantern raised. No one waited, yet the bell rope swayed. A folded timetable lay on the bench. Its cover showed the station's crest and the date, April 14, 1902, precisely 120 years passed to the day. Inside, penciled beside the final downline service, a note read, "Delayed, will arrive after last light, hold the gate." Morning found her restless with thought. She pored over county archives in the cottage study, discovering that on April 14, 1902 a mail train from the Scottish border vanished between two signal posts. Search parties found neither wreckage nor clue. The line closed soon after. Newspapers called it a fog-bound mystery, but villagers blamed a hollow in time along the moor. Amelia copied the accounts, shivering though the stove burned warm. Evening brought new fog. She unlocked the waiting room, struck a match, and lit the wall sconce beside the echo board. A low hum pulsed, deeper than before, resolving into the hiss of steam. The scent of coal drifted through cracks in the floorboards. She sensed rather than heard, carriages slowing just beyond sight. Instinct guided her to the mahogany stand. The tethered pen twitched. A sheet of blank ledger paper slid from beneath the wood as if pushed by unseen fingers. Words formed in dark blue ink. Mail 9 o'clock from Caledon requests clearance to enter. Passengers weary of mist. Platform safe? Her pulse steadied into the hush around her. Fear felt inelegant amid such patient formality. She wrote, "Platform ready, gate unlocked, signal set to green." The ink dried before her eyes. From outside came the clack of points shifting, a sound no rusted mechanism should manage. Lantern in hand, Amelia stepped onto the platform. Fog parted enough to reveal an outline, Tall engine lamps dimmed, paintwork blurred by drifting age. No roar of pistons, only a hushed rolling as though the train moved on rails of breath. Carriage windows glowed with lamplight. Faces appeared, calm, expectant, neither ghostly nor fully solid, like reflections on water at dusk. The engine stopped with gentle precision. Doors remained closed. Amelia felt urged not to board but to witness. A conductor's voice, distant yet clear, called a list of station names that ended at Brackenfell as though the line never extended farther. She realized the vanished train had finally reached its terminus, exactly 1 minute past the century. The bell rang. Doors opened inward but no one stepped down. Instead, small parcels hovered to the platform, wrapped in paper, tied with string, tags bearing contemporary addresses from nearby villages. Messages lost beyond time, perhaps now returned. Amelia counted 12. The conductor tipped his hat toward her, though she could discern no features beneath its brim, only a suggestion of gratitude. The doors closed, wheels whispered, the train slid back into the moor, swallowed by fog without receding sound. She carried the parcels to the cottage, dried them by the stove, and studied each tag. One bore the name of the letting agent's late grandmother, another addressed to a farmstead ruined by fire decades ago. Curious weight rested in every box. She resolved to deliver them at dawn. Before sleep, she entered the waiting room once more. The ledger page now displayed a single line beneath her reply. Service concluded. Gate may rest. She added, parcels received. Platform honored your arrival. The echo board hummed softly, then stilled. Over the next week she walked lanes, placing packages into cautious hands. Contents varied, photographs, pressed wildflowers, a brooch, a pocket Bible, but each recipient felt an immediate, private recognition, as though a chapter of ancestry had slipped home. News spread gently yet without frenzy. Those on the moor respect what arrives by hush. Amelia completed her book, dedicating a final chapter to stations that keep their own schedules. In it she described no phantom train, only the notion that some journeys respect clocks we have forgotten how to read. The day she left, she locked the waiting room, but left the key on the ledger stand in case another caretaker might need it when echoes begin to stir. The lane bent away through blooming gorse. Behind her, the station bell chimed once, clear, brief, content, and the sound folded into birdsong, mingling with the steady breath of open moorland. Snow drifted down in hushed, indecisive spirals, and the grand chalet of Sonnen seemed to breathe more slowly with every flake that touched its eaves. Perched above a narrow valley in the Bernese Alps, the chalet had once hosted winter artist retreats, its timber balconies alive with laughter and the scrape of easels. Now, in early January, only 2 lights showed against the rising dark, one in the concierge's nook near the entryway, and one in room 17, where Mathilde Kramer unpacked sketchbooks she had not opened since autumn. She had come for a month of rest, a gift from her editor after deadlines had turned her nights thin. The chalet promised quiet, just 9 guest rooms, a stone hearth kept on low flame, and snowbound silence stretching in all directions. Herr Ulrich, the concierge, welcomed her with gentle formality, explaining that the staff numbered only 3 in winter. His voice carried the calm cadence of someone who had already made peace with long evenings. Mathilde's room overlooked the valley. Far below, the Sonnen River wound beneath ice, its course marked only by a seam of shadow. She poured tea and listened to the building settle, timbers sighing as though releasing stories they had rehearsed for years. Soon she noticed a pattern beneath the usual creaks. A faint, rhythmic tapping, 5 slow beats and then stillness, repeating at almost perfect intervals. She timed it against her pulse, steady, deliberate, never hurried. At breakfast she asked Herr Ulrich whether another wing might still be under renovation. He shook his head, smile polite but distant. All work finished before the first snow, he assured her. Then after a pause he added, should you hear something unfamiliar, it may be the winter room. Best not to worry. He gave no further explanation, and Mathilde, warmed by coffee and a fire that crackled like distant applause, decided not to press. Days unfolded in gentle sameness. She walked the edge of the pine forest, sketched icicles that hung like glass harps, and returned to evenings of quiet soup and bread. Yet each night, somewhere between the first and second strike of the mantel clock at 9, the tapping began again. 5 measured notes, almost hollow as if knuckles met old oak, followed by silence just long enough to invite attention. On the 4th night curiosity outweighed hesitation. She wrapped herself in a wool coat, lifted a small lamp and stepped into the hall. Snowlight filtered through high windows, turning the corridor into a silver tunnel. Rooms 11 through 15 lay empty, doors locked. But beyond them, half hidden behind a carved screen, she noticed an unlabeled oak door. The tapping sounded once more from the other side. "Good evening," she called, voice pitched low out of instinctive courtesy. No reply came, yet the air felt thick with the sense of someone listening. She tried the handle, it turned, but the door would not move, as though sealed by something subtler than a bolt. Remembering Ulrich's words, she retreated, leaving the corridor to its hush. Next morning a fresh card rested beside her plate in the dining room. "Madame Kramer, the library awaits at 10, should you wish to work beside the south windows." No signature, but an embossed snowflake at the bottom suggested Ulrich's hand. She found the library bright and inviting, yet one shelf held only a single volume, a slim ledger bound in ivory vellum. Its title, pressed in barely visible silver, read "Guests of the Winter Room." Inside, the first page offered a simple instruction: record what you surrender, and the room will return what you have misplaced. Beneath lay rows of entries spanning 80 years. Some surrendered forgetfulness, others a weight in the chest, one simply restless midnights. The return column, however, was blank for every line, as though whatever was given back lived beyond the need for ink. That evening Mathilde placed the ledger on her writing desk and stared at its emptiness. Snow whispered outside, a sideways lullaby. She wrote, "I surrender the urgency that robs evenings of their softness." The moment her pen lifted, a soft click echoed down the hall, the same 5-beat pattern, muffled yet inviting. Lamp in hand, she approached the unlabeled door. This time it opened inward at the lightest touch, revealing a small octagonal chamber paneled in pale spruce. Frosted windows circled the upper walls, collecting moonlight until the air itself resembled still water. At the center stood a low table with 2 objects, a brass metronome ticking in that familiar quintuple pattern, and a closed sketchbook whose cover matched the one she had left in room 17, yet bore no charcoal smudges. She sat on the upholstered bench and opened the book. Inside were crisp, blank pages, but when she turned to the 3rd leaf she found a charcoal drawing already formed. Her own hand poised above a winter hillside, the gesture relaxed, patient. The lines carried a quiet confidence she had not felt in months. She touched the edge of the page, charcoal did not smear. The metronome slowed, its ticks elongating until they matched her breathing, then stopped altogether. A gentle warmth rose through the floorboards, and for a moment she believed she heard distant bells buried under snow, chiming not a warning, but an assurance that time could briefly settle into stillness. She closed the sketchbook and felt the unfamiliar weight of unhurried possibility settle over her shoulders like a shawl. At breakfast she found no card, only her Ulrich's serene nod. She returned the ledger to its shelf, noticing her entry now carried a tiny silver check mark in the return column. Beneath it, in handwriting not her own, one word appeared: softness. She smiled, understanding that the room had accepted her offering and quietly restored what had been misplaced. During the following weeks, she visited the winter room each night. Sometimes the table held a phrase she had forgotten how to write, other times a memory of mountains from her childhood. Each gift arrived without flourish, as natural as breathing. She never stayed long. The chamber seemed to prefer brevity, as though it operated at the border of sleep. When February's first thaw streaked the windows and her departure day neared, she wrote a final line in the ledger: "I surrender nothing. I carry forward what was found." No checkmark followed, and she knew that was correct. The train down valley left at dawn, its whistle dissolving into the white stillness. From her compartment Mathilde glimpsed the chalet, small against the slope, a single window dimly aglow. She could not say whether it belonged to her former room or to the winter room itself, but the light felt steady, like a heartbeat maintained on behalf of travelers who might someday arrive carrying burdens they were ready finally to set down. The letters arrived every Tuesday, addressed to a man who had been dead for 20 years. Margaret Henley noticed them first when she moved into the cottage on Beacon Point. The mail carrier, an elderly man named Thomas, would walk the winding coastal path each week. He would place a single envelope in the weathered mailbox. Then he would tip his cap to the empty lighthouse that stood sentinel on the rocky cliff. Margaret asked Thomas about the letters one morning in October. The sea mist clung to the shoreline like a gray shawl. Thomas paused in his routine, studying her with pale blue eyes that seemed to hold the memory of decades. "For Edmund Whitmore," he said simply. "Been delivering them since I started this route. Never missed a Tuesday." Margaret knew about Edmund Whitmore. The townspeople spoke of him in whispers at the general store. He had been the last lighthouse keeper before automation made his position obsolete. One winter morning in 2003, they found his cottage empty. His bed unslept in. His coffee still warm on the kitchen table. The lighthouse beam had continued its steady rotation through the night, as if nothing had changed. Edmund's body was discovered 3 days later on the rocks below the lighthouse. The coroner ruled it an accident. A man grown careless in his grief over losing his life's work. But the townspeople remembered Edmund as sure-footed as a mountain goat on those familiar cliffs. Now Margaret lived in his cottage. She had inherited it from a great-aunt she barely remembered. The cottage sat in the lighthouse's shadow, connected to the tower by a stone pathway that the ocean spray kept perpetually damp. She began collecting the letters. Each envelope bore the same return address, a post office box in Portland, Maine. The handwriting was careful and feminine. Old-fashioned loops and careful spacing that spoke of another era. Margaret held the letters up to the lamplight each Tuesday evening. The paper was thick and cream-colored. She could see the ghost of words through the envelope, but never enough to decipher their meaning. On a November evening when the wind howled around the lighthouse like a living thing, Margaret climbed the spiral stairs to the lamp room. The automated beacon still turned. Still sent its warning across the dark water. From the circular windows she could see her cottage below. A warm yellow square of light in the vast darkness. That night she dreamed of Edmund Whitmore. He stood in the lamp room, polishing the great lens with infinite care. His movements were methodical, practiced. The work of a lifetime. When he turned toward her, his eyes held the same sadness she had seen in Thomas the mail carrier's face. "She doesn't know," Edmund said in the dream. His voice was soft, nearly lost in the sound of wind and waves. "She keeps writing. Keeps hoping I'll answer." Margaret woke with the dream still vivid in her mind. The next Tuesday she waited by the mailbox for Thomas. When he arrived, she was holding all the unopened letters she had collected. "Who sends them?" she asked. Thomas looked at the stack of envelopes in her hands. For a moment his composure faltered. "His sister Eleanor. Lives in Portland now. Moved there after Edmund." He trailed off, then gathered himself. "She always wrote to him. Every week for 40 years. Old habits, I suppose." Margaret studied the top envelope. The careful handwriting suddenly seemed fragile. Heartbreaking. She doesn't know he's gone? Oh, she knows. Thomas adjusted his mail bag, preparing to continue his route. But knowing and accepting are different things, aren't they? Some love runs too deep for death to stop. That evening, Margaret sat at Edmund's old desk in the cottage. She took out writing paper and a pen. The lighthouse beams swept across her window in its eternal rhythm as she began to write. "Dear Eleanor," she started. "Thank you for your letters. It means more than you know to receive them each week." She wrote about the cottage and the sea. About the way the morning light struck the lighthouse glass. About the peace she found in this place that Edmund had loved. She signed the letter simply, "A friend." The next Tuesday Margaret walked to town and mailed the letter to Portland. When Thomas arrived with Eleanor's weekly letter to Edmund, Margaret smiled and accepted it with quiet reverence. Some mysteries she had learned were not meant to be solved. Only tended to like lighthouse lamps in an endless night. Mist wove silver threads between the arches of the old bridge, as though night were mending a tear in the river. St. Luthien lay deep in the Breton countryside, hidden behind low hills furred with gorse and heather. A single lane wound through the village, crossing the Moron by way of a Roman stone span that no mason alive could entirely explain. Even the oldest parish record spoke of the bridge as something already ancient, already settled into its own patient silence. By day children cycled across, their laughter brushing mossy parapets, and farmers guided small herds from one meadow to another. But once the church bell tolled 9, shutters were drawn, candles trimmed low, and the bridge was left to itself. The river beneath it flowed neither fast nor slow. It moved with that deliberate hush of water that has long grown tired of announcing itself. Eloise Martel arrived on an evening scented with rain-washed hay. A restlessness had followed her south from Paris, humming behind each heartbeat, and her physician, more a family friend than a doctor, had suggested a month in the country. She rented 2 attic rooms above the cooper's shop and found immediate comfort in the rhythm of distant cowbells and the soft creak of wooden eaves. Yet every night, lying beneath a quilt that smelled of lavender, she felt the bridge tug at her thoughts the way the moon tugs at a tide. On her third dusk in St. Luthien, Eloise walked the lane as the last swallows threaded the sky. Lilac shadows pooled where hedges met the road. When she stepped onto the bridge stones, she sensed a temperature shift, as though the air passing between arches had aged a century in the span of a breath. She paused at the midpoint, resting her palms on the cool parapet. Water murmured below, but another sound drifted with it, a faint tapping, rhythmic and measured, like a cane finding its path along flagstones. No one shared the bridge. The lane on either bank stood empty. Still the tapping continued, syncopated with the river's sigh. Eloise waited until the final glow drained from the sky, yet nothing emerged. She retreated to the village, the soft percussion echoing behind her until the cooper's door closed and the attic stair creaked its familiar welcome. Word of the nightly tapping was met with gentle smiles at the bakery queue next morning. Madame Floret, flour dusting her sleeves like pale pollen, shrugged. "The keeper perhaps," she murmured, eyes sliding toward the river. When Eloise asked who the keeper might be, the baker only folded another croissant into her bag and wished her a pleasant day of rest. Curiosity, once invited, grows quietly persistent. After supper, Eloise prepared a small thermos of mint tea, wrapped herself in a knitted shawl, and returned to the bridge before the bell marked 9. The sky was a quilt of indigo and pearl. She leaned against the upstream parapet and listened. At first the river's low conversation filled every moment. Then as the shadows deepened, the tapping began. 3 measured strikes, a pause, 2 softer ones, a longer pause, then the pattern repeating. Eloise closed her eyes and counted the gaps, feeling the cadence settle into her chest like a second pulse. With each cycle an image formed, of someone testing stone, ensuring its strength, keeping travelers safe. When she opened her eyes, the far end of the bridge showed a figure, scarcely more than silhouette, stooped slightly, a walking stick glinting as it met the flagstones. The figure moved with slow precision, tapping each stone, listening, then advancing. Instinct urged greeting, yet the hush of the river seemed to request patience. She watched until the keeper, she had already named the shape thus, reached the midpoint. There the figure paused, lifted a lantern so small its glow resembled a captured firefly, and bowed toward the parapet opposite Eloise. Though the gesture faced away from her, she felt acknowledged, even welcomed. The lantern dimmed, the tapping resumed toward the far bank, and fog gathered behind like a curtain drawing closed. Next morning brought mist that lingered until noon, leaving droplets on every cobweb strung between garden posts. Eloise visited the village archivist, Monsieur Brier, a gentle man who catalogued memories more than documents. Over herbal tea he recounted the bridge's whispered lore, that a mason named Isarn, having built the span centuries ago, vowed to return nightly until the stones admitted no weakness. Some claimed they had seen him at dawn, laying a hand upon the keystone, counting heartbeats against the river's current. "No story stays whole forever," Brier said, arranging fragile maps. "But the tapping, you heard it, yes? Reminds us the promise remains." His eyes, bright with quiet certainty, met hers across motes of dust dancing in sunlit ribbons. That evening Eloise brought a notebook to the bridge. The sky had cleared, revealing a thin crescent moon pinned just above the hills. She recorded the tapping sequence, tracing each pause like notation for a lullaby. When the keeper appeared, she raised her hand in greeting. The figure halted. A pause, longer than the others, breathed between them. Then, with measured grace, the keeper lifted a second lantern from within his cloak and set it upon the parapet at arm's distance from Eloise. The glass sides glowed with a pearl-soft light, neither flame nor electric spark, but something steadier, as if distilled from moonrise itself. The tapping resumed and the figure receded into night. Eloise remained, the lantern casting quiet halos across the notebook pages. She sensed that removing it would be a breach of some gentle covenant, so she left it where it stood, the glow intact, and withdrew only when the church bell counted 10. Villagers noticed the lantern next day, its glow undiminished under sunlight yet somehow unobtrusive. Children traced their fingers over the warm glass. Adults crossed the bridge with respectful nods. No one moved it. By week's end, a second lantern appeared on the opposite parapet, twin in softness. Then a third at the southern arch. Each night, the keeper walked his vigil, ensuring every light was placed, every stone affirmed. Eloise's restlessness quieted. She found she could sleep with the window open, letting river hush and distant tapping guide her dreams. On her final night before returning to Paris, she visited the bridge one last time. The keeper waited at the midpoint, lantern raised. For the first time she saw his face, serene, weathered like lichen-brushed granite, eyes reflecting the Moron's steady current. He inclined his head, an unspoken farewell, then pressed a hand to the keystone. The stone answered with a faint harmonic hum, low and reassuring. When Eloise left at dawn, mist coiled through hedgerows, and the lantern still burned, gentling the path for early shepherds. The tapping followed her a short way up the lane, then faded, as if acknowledging that stones and stories alike were sound beneath her feet. And so the bridge kept its promise, watched over by a presence as old as patience, while the river, forever passing under its arches, carried the secret onward in quiet, unbroken flow. A soft green light pulsed beneath the fog, like an echo seeking its original sound. Clonfera lay on Ireland's western rim where peat-scented fields dropped into the Atlantic, and the only building braving the cliff edge was an abandoned signal house, once the terminus of an undersea telegraph cable that carried news between continents. The cable had long fallen silent, but villagers still spoke of faint glimmers at the cliffs on moonless nights, as though messages persisted even after words were forgotten. Hannah O'Shea arrived in late March, carrying a thermos, a sketchbook, and the quiet intention of avoiding her city inbox for as long as coastal weather allowed. She rented a stone bothy half hidden by thrift and heather. Each morning brought gull cries stitched to wind, each evening the distant hum of waves rearranging shingle. The rhythm softened the tightness behind her eyes quicker than any doctor's advice. On her third dusk, as mist folded over the fields like a linen sheet, Hannah followed a sheep path toward the cliff. The signal house appeared gradually, square, stout, its granite blocks marbled with lichens the color of old copper. She pressed a palm to the wooden door, it moved inward with surprising ease. Inside, salt air lingered, mingling with an undernote of beeswax, as though someone had recently tended a quiet ritual. A single brass instrument remained, the old tape receiver nailed to the far wall. Its iron clockwork drum, once chattering with Morse, now sat still, yet in moonlight its mica window held a faint glow. Beneath the drum lay a wooden spool, and on that spool improbably rested a fresh length of paper tape, blank and unwound. Hannah touched the edge. The paper felt warm as if cupped moments earlier. She smiled, suspecting coastal pranksters, and stepped back into drizzle. That night rain tapped the bothy roof like small, patient questions. At midnight Hannah woke to find a strip of pale tape slipped under her door. Tiny indigo dots and dashes marched across it, clear Morse, though she only recognized the shape of letters, not their meaning. The strips smelled faintly of kelp and lamp oil. She lit a candle, copied the code into her sketchbook, and returned to sleep lulled by the steady metronome of rain. Morning sun silver-plated the ocean. At the village cafe, she borrowed a Morse chart from an elderly fisherman who kept it in his wallet for luck. The decoded message read, "Tide high, letter safe. Come dusk." Amused and gently unsettled, Hannah pocketed the strip, promising herself she would revisit the signal house after supper. Dusk arrived blushing violet. Hannah crossed the cliffs under a shawl of gull wings. Inside the signal house, the drum now turned with silent grace, feeding tape through unseen gears. No key clicked, no relay snapped, yet the dots and dashes formed neat rhythms before her eyes. She watched until the strip ended, then tore it free. The message read, "If you keep watch, we keep time. Ink waits in the drawer." A shallow drawer beneath the bench slid open at her touch. Inside lay a fountain pen and a small bottle of cobalt ink. A brittle ledger, spine cracked but pages blank, rested beside them. On the inside cover someone had written, "Tide letters, keepers and finders." Dates spanning a century followed, each with 2 columns, incoming and response. The most recent line belonged to 1972. After that, blank space waited like calm water. Hannah dipped the pen and wrote the date, then added under response, "Watching." She capped the ink, feeling the house exhale, a breath she sensed more than heard. Outside, the green light blossomed briefly through fog as though acknowledging receipt. Over the next week a gentle correspondence unfolded. Each midnight, another strip of tape slid beneath her door, sometimes damp with sea spray, sometimes crisp as parchment left near a stove. Messages whispered of tide heights, wind shifts, constellations hidden above cloud. She answered in the ledger at dusk, her handwriting slowing to match the patient cadence of surf. Questions crept in: who sends the tape? The response, coded, arrived 2 nights later. The sea remembers every word, we only lend it a voice. Storms rolled in, low and thundering. Windows rattled, but the tape still found her, edges rimmed with salt crystals. One message read, "Cable phrase at Western Trench. Need witness when moon is new." The request felt neither urgent nor benign, simply inevitable. On the appointed night, Hannah stood on the cliff, black water yawning below. Foam trails glowed faintly, tracing a submerged line that pulsed toward the horizon. For one long moment she sensed the cable itself breathing, fibers straining to share weight it could no longer keep secret. Then darkness settled back, and she returned inland carried by the hush of knowledge too deep for words. Her ledger reply was short, "Witnessed. Hold steady." After the storm season broke, tourists began to trickle through the village, their chatter bright and quick. Hannah knew her leave would soon end. She walked to the signal house for a final dusk visit. The tape drum sat idle, its mica window dim. In the ledger, beneath her last entry, new ink glistened. "Time turns, tide returns, keep the door unlatched." She added beneath, "Door unlatched. Thank you for the quiet." Before leaving, she placed fresh ink and paper in the drawer, folded the blanket she had brought against cold nights, and wedged the door open just enough for salt wind to wander through. On the path back, she glanced toward the cliff edge. A soft green pulse answered, brief but certain, like a lighthouse whose beam was meant solely for those already safe on shore. The following morning she boarded the bus east. As fields rolled by, she reached into her coat pocket and found one last strip of tape she had not noticed before. The code translated simply to, "Carry calm." She folded it into her diary, feeling the gentle weight of unsent words settle into quiet certainty. And far behind her, the cable beneath Atlantic waves held its steady breath, waiting for the next keeper who might pause to listen when fog and night conspired to speak. In that unhurried dark, even the river hushed its usual chatter, slipping between limestone banks with muted grace. Above the water, the narrow village of Elkburg drowsed. One lane of pastel houses, a shuttered bakery, a chapel whose bell had not been rung in 3 decades. At the far edge, half hidden by walnut trees, stood House Marienfels, an ivy-clad mansion long since emptied of family but not, locals said, of memory. Marianne Voigt arrived alone just after sundown. A cultural conservator from Trier, she had been asked to inventory the estate's remaining art before the property changed hands. Her small rental car clicked as it cooled, otherwise all lay still. She paused at the wrought iron gate, listening to crickets count the seconds between their calls. Somewhere on the slope an owl gave one contemplative note, then let silence close around it like water. Past the gate, a gravel drive curved toward the house. Fallen walnuts cracked softly beneath her shoes, the sound oddly muted beneath the dense canopy. Moonlight caught on upper windows, glazing them silver, while lower panes remained dark. The front door opened with a faint exhale, as though relieved to feel a human presence again. Inside, her torch beam found parquet floors dusted in pale pollen, tapestries bleached to the color of antique lace, and corridor walls lined with portraits whose eyes followed gently rather than sternly. She set her satchel on a console table, took out a slim notebook and noted the air's scent. Cedar, faint beeswax, and something like pressed grapes, sweet, distant. A grandfather clock stood in the foyer, pendulum motionless. Yet the mechanism emitted a subdued ticking, as if the seconds were still being marked somewhere inside, just not displayed. She touched the glass. The pendulum stirred, swung once, then rested again. The ticking remained calm, content. Guided by a rough floor plan, Marianne sought the music room at the rear. Prior appraisals hinted that a forgotten painting, perhaps a minor romantic landscape, might hang there. She crossed a gallery where moonlit motes drifted like slow snow. Her footsteps matched the rhythm of the hidden clock. One, pause, another, pause, an inward breath between each sound. The music room opened onto a terrace facing the river. French doors stood ajar, letting cool air brush velvet drapes. Inside, a silent grand piano glimmered under linen sheets. On the far wall hung an unframed canvas, its colors dim but intact. She approached. The scene depicted a twilight riverbend almost identical to the one outside, though the brushstroke moon rode higher than the moon she had just left behind. In the painted sky, a single bright star pulsed with unblended pigment, as if insisting on attention. Marianne lifted her torch. The paint of that lone star caught the light differently, throwing back a faint shimmer that seemed to move. Not flicker. Move as though adjusting its span. Against instinct, she dimmed the torch. With darkness restored, the painted star settled, no longer restless, merely present. She turned to catalog the piano. When she lifted the sheet, a mild chord whispered from within, produced by no visible hand. The strings, long untuned, resonated just enough to form a suggestion of sound, for notes rising, pausing, then descending. She felt no jolt of fear, only a gentle beckoning, like someone inviting her to recall a melody half forgotten. From the hallway, that subdued ticking grew clearer, though no hour struck. She checked the foyer clock again, pendulum still. Yet the house maintained its pulse, soft, generous. She wrote in her notebook, "Time here seems shelved but not stopped." On the landing above, a corridor ran toward the estate's small observatory tower. Previous caretakers had reported nothing of interest there, but the subtle half-sound from the piano inclined her to explore. She climbed the staircase, each step flexing under old timber's sigh. At the top, a stained glass window cast dappled moon shapes onto the floor. They shifted slowly, not like ordinary light, but more as if the window itself breathed through color. The observatory door yielded to a gentle push. Inside, dust lay untouched on a brass telescope capped and lowered. Yet a single chair faced away from the instrument, positioned instead toward a narrow internal window that overlooked the music room below. Marianne crossed to it, feeling the ticking deepen into her bones. Through the window she saw the painting again, and now the painted star glowed a shade warmer than before, pale gold rather than frosty white. Beside the chair, a small writing desk held an open diary. The most recent entry, dated 40 years earlier, read in looping ink. Star added to the river scene tonight. Will a line paint to sound, waiting for the house to accept the tempo. No signature. A blot of ink followed, like a final breath caught on paper. Marianne sat, letting her pulse slow to match the house's. Below, the moonlit terrace remained empty, the river glimmered like liquid pewter. From the unseen piano rose the same 4 notes, slightly surer now, their decay lingering a heartbeat longer. The painted star brightened in sympathy, then dimmed as though pleased at being heard. She understood then that House Marianne Fells was still composing something unfinished. a harmony between clock, canvas, and chord, each element waiting decades for a listener willing to measure the pauses. She had no role but to notice. Gently, she closed the diary, left everything untouched, and descended the stairs. In the foyer, she set her notebook beside the grandfather clock and wrote only one line: "Artwork and instruments stable. House continues its slow duet with silence." She replaced the slip and felt the ticking fade, satisfied with acknowledgement. Outside, vineyard rows stretched in moonlit terraces, leaves stirring with barely a sound. As Marianne latched the gate, the unseen clock gave a single perfectly clear tick that reached her across the drive. Nothing else followed. The owl hooted once, echoing that lone beat, then settled into quiet. She walked toward the inn at the village edge, gravel crunching softly, heart paced to the river's measured flow. Behind her, House Marienfels receded into walnut shadows, still painting its night, still teaching its forgotten piano to breathe between notes, still keeping time without hands, content that someone had paused long enough to feel its gentle pulse. The small town of Frost Haven, Minnesota, pressed itself into midwinter silence. Shutters latched, chimneys breathing faintly, street lamps haloed by ice crystals. A single footpath wound from the sleepy main street to the old North Star Observatory, a brick turret seated on a rocky island like a forgotten sentinel. Though its telescope had lain dormant for decades, locals swore a thin beam sometimes glimmered through the dome on moonless nights, as though the sky still waited to be read. Dr. Eleanor Lewis arrived just past dusk, breath curling around the collar of her wool coat. She had come at the invitation of the County Historical League to evaluate the observatory's surviving star charts, rare photographic plates rumored to contain early aurora recordings. Her boots cracked over lake ice that hummed softly beneath each step, a sound low enough to feel rather than hear. Wind hissed through cattails along the shore, then receded, leaving only the muted echo of her own heartbeat. The observatory door, oak warped silver gray, surrendered after a polite shove. Inside, her lantern cast a modest circle of light, revealing wooden floors where frost mapped delicate ferns across planks. The air smelled of cold iron and distant cedar smoke. Against the far wall loomed the great telescope, angled toward a ragged hole in the copper dome. Snowflakes fell through the gap, drifting lazily onto the brass gears like soft confetti at a forgotten celebration. She closed the door, letting stillness settle. On a nearby desk, a ledger lay open beneath a thin crust of snow. The ink had bled slightly, yet one entry remained clear. December 13, 1954, star R227 observed to pulse 4 times, then pause. Beneath the note, someone had penciled a faint line, "Wait for the 5th." Eleanor traced the words with a gloved finger, feeling no chill despite the frost. Shelves along the circular wall held narrow drawers labeled by constellation. She opened one marked Cassiopeia, and found glass plates wrapped in tissue paper, edges silvered, images visible when tilted toward the lantern. Nebulae glimmered like tiny frost flowers, precise yet haunting. Among them lay a folded envelope addressed simply to the returning eye. She hesitated, then lifted the flap. Inside rested a single sheet of vellum bearing coordinates and a short instruction. Focus at 18 degrees above north horizon, precisely 1 hour after silence begins. No date, no signature. She glanced upward. Through the dome's breach the sky blushed purple-black, stars beginning to crystallize. Silence, she realized, had already unfurled itself across the lake. No vehicles, no barking dogs, only the faint pulse of her own breath. Guided by habit more than thought, she loosened the telescope's frozen gears until they turned with surprising grace. Snowflakes fled the lens as though granted leave. She dialed the coordinates, aligning the scope toward an unobtrusive patch of sky. The eyepiece felt cold but welcoming against her brow. At first she saw only ordinary stars, steady and indifferent. Then, at the fringe of her vision, a shimmer trembled, one point brightening, dimming, brightening again. 4 pulses, deliberate, measured. She counted them aloud, voice scarcely above a sigh. A pause followed, long enough for the mind to wonder whether anything more would occur. When the 5th pulse finally came, it lingered slightly, as if aware of being watched, before subsiding into ordinary starlight. Eleanor exhaled the breath she hadn't realized she held. The room around her seemed to lean inward, waiting. From the ledger's desk, a soft tap answered, no louder than a snowflake striking wood, yet it carried distinct intention. She crossed the room. The ledger's pages had turned themselves. A fresh sheet lay exposed, blank except for a faint wet circle, as though ink had only just lifted from the nib. A pen rested beside it, point glistening dark even in the dim light. Without resisting, she picked it up. Her hand moved gently, writing a single observation. The fifth returns the gaze. She set the pen down. Almost immediately the lantern flame wavered, not from draught but as though drawing breath. Shadows drifted across instruments, arranging themselves into deeper calm. In that hush, Eleanor felt the observatory slip into a lullaby rhythm, walls expanding and contracting like lungs settled for sleep. She closed the ledger, replaced the glass plates, and sealed the envelope back within the Cassiopeia drawer. The telescope she left trained on the dark horizon, content to keep its silent vigil. Before departing, she paused at the center of the dome, letting stray snow settle on her hair. Somewhere beneath the ice, the lake sighed, a resonant creak that traveled up through stone and floorboards. It sounded uncannily like a distant echo of her own thoughts, returning from below rather than above. Outside, night had deepened to still velvet. The path homeward glittered faintly, moon shards embedded in ice. As she stepped onto the lake once more, Eleanor glanced back. Through the observatory's broken cap, a thin shaft of starlight now glimmered, brighter than any lantern, pointing upward with quiet certainty. She knew the townsfolk might glimpse it and speak again of ghostly astronomers, but she sensed nothing spectral, only a calm conversation continuing between sky and stone, resumed after a long pause. Halfway to shore she stopped, listening. Wind skimmed across the frozen surface, carrying a distant, measured rhythm. For soft gusts, a pause, a fifth answering sigh. Something in the pattern eased her shoulders, smoothing the tightness of travel from her muscles. She resumed walking, boots whispering against snow, feeling oddly accompanied. Frosthaven's lights blinked welcomingly at the lake's edge. Behind her, the observatory settled back into shadow, the beam dimming until only ordinary starlight remained. Yet Eleanor sensed the fifth pulse would return, again and again, waiting patiently for anyone willing to cross the ice and breathe in time with the hush. By the time she reached the inn, fatigue arrived gentle as flannel. She knew her report to the Historical League would be concise. Plates stable, building sound, further study advised at night, but in her private notebook she jotted another line. Some instruments marked the passage between beats, and some watchers learned to listen there. With that thought, she closed the journal, welcomed sleep, and trusted the stars to keep their silent appointment until dawn. A fine salt mist drifted in from the North Atlantic, and with it came a hush so complete that the old lamps along Avansford Quay seemed to breathe rather than burn. No one truly remembered when the lamps had first appeared, cast iron stems rooted in granite, their glass panes rippling like pond water, yet every evening at exactly 8, they brightened in perfect unison, unmarred by wind or rain, as though a hidden hand tended them. The town lay folded between headland and sea, its slate roofs huddled closely, its streets cobbled with stones smoothed by centuries of patient tides. Fishermen spoke in low tones, shopkeepers closed early, and visitors, sensing an unnamed etiquette, slowed their steps without knowing why. Even the gulls, overhead, called half-heartedly, their wings barely disturbing the fog that curled along eaves and chimneys. On this particular evening in late November, Nora Bennett walked the quay path alone. She had come from London for quiet, renting a small attic room above Mrs. Kersey's bakery. Her doctor had advised rest for a mind worn thin by city hours and ceaseless conversation. Avansford offered silence in generous measure. But it also offered questions that floated like sea foam, clinging, refusing to dissolve. Nora paused beside the third lamp from the harbor mouth, a lamp whose glass always showed a faint amber stain, as though dusk itself had settled inside. She watched the minute hand of her pocket watch climb toward 8. The second hand ticked with deliberate poise, and she felt her own pulse match it, steady and unhurried. 8 chimes from the church tower drifted across slate and water. The lamps lifted their glow at the very first note. They brightened neither quickly nor slowly, but in a soft flourishing, the way dawn unfolds behind closed eyelids. Nora looked for movement, perhaps the tilt of a ladder or the sweep of a wick trimmer, but there was nothing. Just the lamps awake once more. Local legend spoke of a lamplighter named Elias Reed, a quiet man who, long ago, had walked the quay with a pole and lantern each twilight. After 40 years of service he had vanished on a winter's night, leaving his pole beside the harbor steps and his lantern dark. The lamps, townsfolk claimed, had kindled themselves ever since, following some covenant of loyalty. Children retold the tale in whispers at school, their eyes widening as clouds rolled in earlier each afternoon. Adults, questioned gently, smiled with polite indifference as though asked about dreams half recalled. Nora, restless in her attic room, opened the window a crack and let the odor of cooling bread slip past the ruffle of stale cinnamon. She unfolded sheets of hotel stationery and wrote observations, dates, times, the hue of the sky at each lighting, the order in which gulls settled upon the quay rails. Each note steadied her, the way arranging seashells along a sill can soothe wandering thoughts. But a question throbbed beneath her careful catalogue. What might happen if a lamp were removed? Would the remaining lights falter, or would they burn on, indifferent? One midnight, wrapped in a fisher's wool coat borrowed from an unguarded peg, she carried a small stepladder to the farthest lamp, the one closest to the abandoned cannery. The moon hung low, polished by cloud. She climbed, hands trembling more from hush than cold. With a soft click she lifted the latch that held the glass pane. The metal was neither warm nor cool. It felt like stone submerged in deep water. Inside no flame danced. Instead, a pearl-colored glow spread evenly as though the air itself carried light. She reached with gloved fingers, intending to cup the glow and learn its weight, but the moment her hand crossed the threshold the light receded, contracting to a single point. It hovered, quivering, no larger than a pinhead, then slipped past her wrist into the night. It floated upward, joined by a second point from the next lamp, then a third, until 10 tiny lights drifted above the quay like dandelion seeds. Down below, the iron posts emptied, the glass panes darkening to mirror the sea. Nora descended, every plank beneath her boot drawing a hollow tone from the pier. A wind bowed through the alleys, shutters tapped. The church clock, unbidden, chimed once, though the hour was neither whole nor half. From windows, curious faces appeared, lit by candles, their eyes wide with the shared recognition that something familiar had slipped. The points of light gathered at the harbor mouth, arranging themselves in a slow spiral. Their brightness did not glare, it soothed like the reflection of stars on gentle water. They turned, drifting seaward until the fog swallowed them. And with their leaving, darkness folded itself over Avansford, deeper than any resident could recall. In the days that followed, shops remained closed. Boats stayed moored, their prows rocking in tides that seemed hesitant. Children, waking early, asked parents why the sky felt heavy. Mrs. Kersey, flower upon her sleeves, found Nora's attic room vacant save for neatly stacked notes and an unfinished letter addressed to no one. The lamps choose their hour, the sea its witness. I only opened a door already ajar. By the end of the week, townsfolk returned to routines, though slower now measured. Someone installed new electric fixtures along the quay, powered by hidden cables and sturdy switches. They shone adequately, practical and pale. Yet each evening at 8, just as the modern bulbs warmed, a faint shimmer danced upon the horizon, as though 10 silent lanterns still lingered beyond sight, guiding something home. No one spoke of Elias Reed, nor of Nora Bennett. Yet a gentle reluctance filled every twilight, a pause in conversation, a collective breath held between waves and stone. The quay remained, solid as ever, but the air around it felt thinner, expectant. And in that expectant hush, the town of Avansford discovered a new kind of quiet, one layered with the memory of lamplight, drifting somewhere out at sea, promising return yet offering only the calm ache of wondering. Water lapped gently at pilings, brushing stone with a faint rhythmic hush that sounded almost like distant applause. Venice, after the last vaporetto, exhaled into stillness. Shutters closed, footsteps faded, and moonlight spread across tiled roofs and quiet sheets. Down a narrow fondamenta, the little Baroque theater waited, facade softened by moss, its lacquered doors unvisited for 40 years. Aurelia Conti had come at the invitation of the city's cultural archive, asked to assess what survived inside. Ledgers, costumes, forgotten scores. She carried only a canvas satchel and a brass-handled lantern. The key, left for her at the caretaker's cottage, turned with surprising ease as if the lock expected her touch. The doors opened on chilled air scented faintly of velvet and dust. The foyer revealed gilt mirrors gone dim, their surfaces stippled by age like watercolor skies. A faded carpet hushed Aurelia's steps. She paused beside the ticket kiosk where an abacus still rested, beads midway between counts. Through an arch lay the auditorium, rows of red seats folding upward in gentle tiers toward an ornate ceiling painted with night blue constellations. Stars there seemed to echo the real ones beyond the roof, the two firmaments almost in conversation. No draft moved, yet one seat in the center aisle sat lower than the rest, cushion compressed by an unseen weight. Aurelia registered this quietly, neither alarmed nor eager to explain. She set the lantern on the edge of the orchestra pit. Its glow drifted outward like warm breath, illuminating specks of dust that ascended and sank as though dancing to a secret tempo. Past the stage curtain, she found a backstage corridor. Ropes hung slack beside sandbags, their fibers whispering when brushed by her coat sleeve. Dressing rooms opened left and right, lit only by the lantern's wandering circle. In one, a trio of masks lay upon a vanity, expressions serene rather than dramatic. Each retained a faint sheen unclouded by time. Aurelia touched none, but noted a subtle warmth lingering over the porcelain, as if lamps had been extinguished mere minutes earlier. At the corridor's end, she reached the music library. Shelves bowed under leather-bound volumes, spines labeled in gilt, arias, madrigals, intermezzi. On the central table rested a narrow folio tied with ribbon the color of old rose petals. A tag read, Sinfonia per la Nebbia, first draft. She untied the ribbon. The manuscript pages bore delicate notation, yet between staves ran fine penciled phrases, leave room for mist, pause until silence answers. Tempo follows breath, not baton. She felt the urge to hum a single bar but refrained. Even an exhaled note might stir something better left placid. Instead, she unfolded her notebook and copied a few measures. The ink from her pen seemed almost to welcome the company of those older marks, aligning themselves gently on the page. Somewhere above, a faint rustle drifted down, wood rubbing against wood, perhaps a shutter shifting. Aurelia listened. The sound stopped, replaced by a softer murmur, a roll of pages turning in the empty auditorium, deliberate yet unhurried. She pictured the lone seat half-folded, now settling farther, as though its hidden occupant adjusted posture to follow her progress backstage. Returning to the auditorium, she held the lantern waist-high. The seat now stood upright, cushion undisturbed. Nothing else had moved, yet in the orchestra pit a conductor's baton rested across the music stand, parallel to the edge, gleaming faintly. It had not been there earlier. Aurelia approached, her calm intact, and noticed a slip of parchment beneath the baton's tip. 3 words in graceful script, attend the hush. She obeyed without thinking, extinguishing the lantern. Darkness enfolded her, velvet soft. At first she heard only the breathing of the building. Wooden beams settling, water beyond the walls sipping at foundations. Then, from somewhere uncertain, perhaps the balcony, perhaps the imagined rafters above the false stars, issued a single chord, whispered rather than played, like the echo of a distant cello warming its strings. The tone lingered, trembling at the edge of hearing, before fading into a silence deeper than the one preceding it. She waited, heart steady, until a second chord answered, lower, slower, an amiable exchange, unresolved yet tender. The pause that followed stretched long enough to feel like a held breath spanning centuries. In that hollow, a curious peace settled over her shoulders, as though the theater recognized in her a respectful listener. When the third chord came, soft, barely tangible, it drifted outward, dissolved, and did not return. The hush that followed felt complete, needing nothing more. Aurelia relit the lantern. The baton lay precisely where she had found it. The parchment was gone. She completed her survey without haste, recording temperatures, photographing set pieces left inside wings like motionless actors waiting for a cue that would never arrive. The manuscript she returned to its ribbon and shelf. Before leaving, she took one final look at the auditorium. The ceiling's painted constellations seemed brighter now, a gentle glow emanating from their faded pigments, guiding her gaze along imagined currents of night. Outside, the canal touched stone with its patient rhythm. Aurelia locked the doors, pocketed the key, and began along the narrow path toward the caretaker's cottage. Behind her, the theater's facade melted once more into shadow, its secrets folded neatly between silence and remembrance. At the crossing bridge she paused. A breeze carried a faint vibration across the water, an echo of those whispered chords, then let it dissipate into the moonlit mist. She smiled, knowing the music would return for the next listener willing to attend the hush. Sleep beckoned gently, promising that whatever mysteries lingered on that small stage would keep their own immaculate time, serenading empty velvet rows with chords delicate enough to drift through dreams without waking them. A single lamp glowed in the valley like a winter star that had lost its sky. Kittredge Hollow, tucked between low ridges of the Catskills, rarely troubled anyone's maps, yet each December the snow arrived with almost ceremonial devotion, blanketing clapboard porches, swallowing fences, and muffling even the creek that traced the main road. At the very center of the village stood a narrow brick building once labeled Telegraph and Post. The telegraph line had long since sagged into the trees, but the post office endured in the hands of Robert Finch, a spare man with silver-rimmed spectacles and the patience of weathered stone. 6 days a week he turned the brass key in the door, sorted the few envelopes that came, and brewed chicory coffee whose aroma drifted through the slot blinds like a quiet promise. Whenever storms blocked the mountain pass, deliveries ceased, yet Robert kept his ritual. He unlocked the wooden pigeonholes, dusted counters, and listened to the clock that chimed half hours with a timber-soft note. Villagers said the postmaster was not keeping time so much as keeping company with time, making sure it did not feel abandoned during the long white months. On the first Thursday of Advent, the snow deepened beyond the wheel ruts, and the mail truck, expected from Kingston, did not appear. Twilight found Robert alone in the small lobby, candles lit along the windowsill, gold wax catching the dusky hush. He prepared to close when he noticed a letter lying on the floor just inside the slot. No footsteps outside, no telltale thunk of the lid. The envelope was cream, edges deckled, the address written in ink the color of spruce needles. To the resident of the postmaster's chair, Kittredge Hollow, where the mountains listen. There was no stamp, no return. The paper felt faintly warm, as if it had slept in a pocket close to a hearth. Robert slit the flap with his bone knife and withdrew a single page. The pass is closed, yet certain words must still find their way. At midnight, unlock the back door. Leave the lamp lit. Receive what comes with quiet hands. No signature followed, only a hand-drawn sigil of a snowflake encircling a compass rose. Robert recalled no such emblem from any postal ledger. Still, the language bore the courtesy of seasoned correspondence, and courtesy to him was reason enough. He stoked the iron stove, then arranged a lone chair beside the service counter. Snow ticked against the windows like soft chalk on slate. The village beyond lay dark except for porch lanterns swallowed in drifted collars of white. Minutes, then hours, threaded past. The clock chimed 11:30, its note swallowed almost before it could fade. At precisely midnight, Robert rose, crossed the sorting room, and lifted the latch of the rear door. Cold air folded inward, carrying a scent of pine sap and distant wood smoke. No figure waited, yet on the stoop rested a leather satchel, frost gilding its seams. Robert brought it inside, setting it beneath the brass ceiling lamp. The bag, though small, felt heavier than fresh mail should. He opened the buckles. Inside lay dozens of envelopes, each addressed in the same spruce ink hand, destinations ranging from cottages along the valley to outlying farms seldom seen until spring thaw. He checked the dates. None bore one. In the stamp's place, each envelope carried that snowflake compass sigil. Robert sorted them methodically into pigeonholes, finding enough letters to fill every slot. even those owners long since moved away or passed on. He hesitated over those names, yet custom compelled him. Mail must be delivered or at least offered the chance. Only when the last envelope found a home did he notice a second compartment in the satchel. There, tucked like a final thought, waited a journal bound in gray linen. The first entry read, "I trust the Hollow's keeper of messages will honor the covenant. Winter is a boundary, words are bridges. Guard them until the thaw." Subsequent pages listed dates stretching back 50 winters, each with notations of storms and deliveries made despite them, always at midnight, always without witness. The most recent line left a space for the present year. Robert closed the journal slowly. A hush settled so deep he heard the tick within the clock's gears, a small heart braving cold silence. Morning raised a brittle blue light over snowdrifts sculpted into sleeping giants. Villagers arrived on sled or snowshoe, expecting emptiness, and found instead every pigeonhole filled. Abigail Marsh, whose husband had ventured west 2 winters ago, opened an envelope and gasped at the neat paragraphs inside. News of safe passage across the plains, a promise to return come spring. Old Mr. Calder received schematics for a windmill he had dreamed of building before his joints stiffened. Even the abandoned box labeled Hopewell Cabin, empty for 20 years, contained a letter for its last occupant, penned in a child's uncertain script, saying simply, "I remember the lilacs." Throughout the day a gentle awe threaded conversation. How had the mail arrived? Who braved the pass? Robert only smiled, handing out envelopes, offering no theory beyond the fact that messages, like seeds under snow, found their moment to rise. That night, after locking the front door, he opened the journal and inked the date in the waiting space. Beside it he wrote, "Received and entrusted, bridges intact." Then he closed the volume and replaced it in the satchel, now empty of letters but ready for another season's cargo. Snow continued for 6 more weeks. The official postal route remained impassable. Yet every dusk, footprints appeared behind the brick building, single strides evenly spaced, leading to the door and vanishing again beyond the elms. Robert never heard them arrive, never caught a silhouette against the lantern light. Still, on his desk he occasionally found an empty mug, faint steam curling as though shared hospitality needed no words. When equinox neared and the pass finally opened, the first Kingston truck rolled into the hollow. The driver remarked on tidy stacks of outgoing mail waiting in the crate, responses penned through darkest winter, dreams wrapped in paper, ready for the wider world. He asked how Robert kept spirits lifted while the valley lay cut off. "We were never truly cut off," Robert said, sealing a last canvas sack. "The roads we travel aren't always marked on maps." Spring loosened the ridge shadows, creeks rushed with newfound voice, and the satchel rested once more behind the sorting desk, patient as seed in soil. Robert polished its buckles, then dimmed the lamp, confident that when snow returned and midnight called, the unseen courier would keep faith, riding the silent pass where mountains listen and words, unlost, glide over drifts like sparrows searching out old roofs. The 11:47 train to nowhere arrived every night at the abandoned Millfield station, though the tracks had been removed 20 years ago. James Crawford first heard it during his 3rd week as night security guard at the old railway depot. The building had been converted into a cultural center, its waiting rooms transformed into gallery spaces and its ticket office into a coffee shop that served commuters who now traveled by bus and car. The sound began as a distant whistle, lonesome and clear in the midnight air. Then came the rhythmic chatter of wheels on rails, growing steadily louder as the phantom locomotive approached the station. James could hear the hiss of steam brakes, the mechanical sigh of doors opening, the shuffle of passengers boarding and alighting. By the time James reached the platform, the sounds had faded. All that remained was the empty space where tracks had once carried trains to destinations throughout New England. Weeds grew between the old railroad ties that had been left as a historical display, and the platform stretched into darkness under stars that reflected off rails that were no longer there. James mentioned the phantom train to Margaret Ellis, the Cultural Center's director, during his first weekly check-in. "Oh yes," Margaret said, not looking up from the grant application she was reviewing. "That would be the 11:47. Quite a few people have mentioned hearing it over the years. You don't seem surprised. Margaret set down her pen and regarded James with the patient expression of someone who had fielded this question many times before. This station served the community for over a century, James. Some habits die hard. But there are no tracks anymore. No, Margaret agreed. There haven't been tracks since the line was discontinued in 2003. But the station remembers its purpose. And apparently so do the passengers. James began staying awake specifically to listen for the 11:47. The train arrived with remarkable consistency, never more than a minute or two off schedule. He could distinguish between different types of locomotives, sometimes the deep whistle of a steam engine, other nights the horn of a diesel. Occasionally he heard what sounded like the sleek rush of a modern electric train. More intriguingly, James began to recognize patterns in the sounds of passengers. Some nights the platform seemed crowded with footsteps, voices, and the bustle of luggage being moved. Other nights only a few passengers seemed to board or disembark, their movements quiet and purposeful in the darkness. James started keeping a log of the phantom train's arrivals, noting variations in locomotive type, passenger activity, and weather conditions. He discovered that steam engines appeared more frequently during winter months, while modern trains seemed to prefer clear summer nights. The busiest passenger activity occurred around holidays and the start of school terms. One particularly clear October night, James decided to position himself directly on the old platform as 11:47 approached. He stood where passengers would have waited for real trains in the station's active years, listening carefully as the familiar sounds grew closer. The whistle sounded. The locomotive approached with its steady rhythm. Brakes hissed. Doors opened with their mechanical precision, and James saw them. Translucent figures moved along the platform with the purposeful energy of travelers. A woman in a 1940s coat carried a suitcase and consulted a pocket watch. A young soldier in uniform embraced someone who might have been his sweetheart. Children pressed their faces to what would have been train windows, waving goodbye to relatives on the platform. The passengers were from different eras, dressed in clothing that spanned decades of the station's operation. They moved with the distinctive urgency of people catching trains, some hurrying to board, others savoring final moments before departure, a few arriving with the relief of journeys completed. James watched, transfixed, as the ghostly scene played out around him. An elderly conductor called, "All aboard," in a voice that carried the authority of countless such announcements. Steam, or the memory of steam, rose from an invisible locomotive. Then, as always, the sounds faded. The platform returned to its empty present, and James stood alone under the stars with only the gentle sound of wind moving through the trees that had grown up along the old right-of-way. The next morning, James visited the local historical society to research the station's past. He learned that Millfield Station had been a crucial stop on the route between Boston and Montreal, serving not just daily commuters but also vacation travelers heading to lake resorts and ski areas. Soldiers had departed from this platform during 2 world wars. Children had arrived each summer to spend vacations with grandparents in the countryside. Mrs. Dorothy Harrison, the Historical Society's volunteer curator, showed James photographs of the station in its prime. The images captured exactly what he had witnessed the night before. The same purposeful energy, the same mix of departure and arrival, joy and sadness that characterized all train stations. People formed deep attachments to this place, Mrs. Harrison explained. For many families, it was where they said hello and goodbye to the most important people in their lives. That kind of emotional significance doesn't just disappear when you remove the tracks. He started greeting the phantom passengers during their nightly arrival, offering a respectful nod to conductors and a gentle word to children who seemed nervous about their travels. The ghostly figures began to acknowledge his presence in return, a tip of a hat, a smile, a wave from a train window. Some nights, when the platform was particularly crowded with travelers from across the decades, James would hear conversations that spanned generations. The 11:47 train, James realized, was not really going to nowhere. It was going to everywhere and everyone that mattered to the people who had once depended on this station for connection to the wider world. It carried passengers not to geographical destinations, but to the moments and relationships that had defined their lives. On quiet nights when few phantom passengers appeared, James would sometimes hear the train slow down as if the conductor was checking to see if anyone needed to board. In those moments, James understood that the 1147 was an invitation, a reminder that some journeys transcend the physical world, and that the most important destinations are often found not in distance traveled, but in the depth of connection between hearts that refuse to let go of what matters most. The cultural center thrived in its renovated station, hosting art exhibitions and concerts that filled the old waiting rooms with new life. But every night at 1147, the building remembered its original purpose, welcoming passengers whose love for this place and each other had made them eternal travelers on railways that existed beyond the need for steel and steam. A thin ribbon of mist curled above the pond, a silent sundial marking the slow drift of dawn. Stillwater Glen was the sort of New Hampshire village that hid almost on purpose, cradled by white pines and granite ledges, its 3 clapboard houses mirrored in water smooth enough to hold secrets. The only road arrived, then politely turned back the way it came. Just beyond the far bank stood a shingled boathouse with a cedar cupola and a narrow tower stitched to its side. Locals called the structure the water clock, though most had never seen it operate. The tower's upper window held a wooden dial carved with small moons. Beneath it ran a channel, guiding pond water through unseen gears. Old deeds stated that when the dial revolved at midnight, the glen's level would settle true, neither flooding nor drying, as though time itself checked the pond's pulse. Clara Whitford arrived in midsummer, seeking refuge after a year of hurried city evenings. She rented the vacant lakefront cabin, bringing only field journals, her grandfather's pocket barometer, and a quiet wish for hours wide enough to unfold in. The first night, as frogs stitched soft patterns in reeds, she noticed the tower window pulsing with faint amber. One slow glow, one slow fade, 2 measured to be candlelight. The pond, meanwhile, lay perfectly still, cradling the reflection like an echoed breath. Come morning, Clara asked Mrs. Dyer, who ran the post shack and berry stand, whether the clock still kept time. The woman's smile was gentle, almost apologetic. It keeps its time, she said, wiping dew from cartons of blueberries. Best let it be. There was no further discouragement, only an older hush slipping between their words. Days filled with soft chores, sketching cattails, recording air pressure, noting the pond's glassy patience. Yet each night, somewhere between 11 and 1, the amber glow returned, revolving behind the wooden dial like a guarded heartbeat. Clara, drawn by cautious intrigue, began walking the shoreline at dusk. She discovered that willow leaves nearest the boathouse quivered even on windless evenings, as if stirred by distant machinery. On the 7th night, clouds covered the moon, and darkness pressed gently against the water's skin. Clara stood at the tower door, a padlock hanging open, its clasp unlatched as though waiting. She hesitated, remembered Mrs. Dyer's softened warning, then stepped inside. The air was cool, tinged with cedar and iron. A wooden stair curved upward, threads of lamplight spilling down steps worn smooth by time but not by recent feet. She climbed carefully. At the summit, the room widened into a circular chamber. Brass troughs guided pond water through a lattice of wheels. Drops struck resonant bowls tuned to quiet notes, a hidden music scarcely louder than breath. Against the far wall, a work table held quills, corked ink, a single ledger, and a small glass filled to its brim with still pond water that never spilled, no matter how the gears turned. The dial disc, thinner than she expected, rotated once each minute, not by clockwork but by the measured flow beneath. As the disc completed its circle, a single drop lifted from the glass, drawn upward, defying gravity, then stitched itself into the wood before sliding down a narrow groove carved into the tower wall. Outside, the amber glow brightened at that precise moment. Clara watched 5 cycles, feeling her pulse slow to the mechanism's patient cadence. She opened the ledger. Pages smelled of birch and distant rain. Entries stretched back 180 years, each dated simply by season and moon phase. Each carried 3 measured lines. Level, mirror. Sky, listening. Visitor, name. Sometimes the visitor line read none. sometimes an initial followed by a brief note, spoke of forgetfulness, offered silver coin to water, sang lullaby for willow roots. The last entry stood blank, except for yesterday's date, visitor. The pen lay uncapped, ink unstained. Something within Clara steadied. She wrote her name then, for reasons she could not later explain, added, left the city's noise by the shore. Ink dried instantly, as though absorbed not by paper but by the quiet itself. A soft click answered from below. The sluice gates shifted, releasing a hushed ribbon of water back into the pond. The wooden dial paused, lights dimmed, and within the stillness Clara sensed the pond exhale. She closed the ledger, replaced the cap, and descended, locking the door as she found it, though she could not recall seeing the key. Morning brought silvery calm. The pond mirrored the sky so perfectly that clouds appeared unsure where to drift. Mrs. Dyer handed Clara her mail and, noting her restful gaze, simply said, "You found its rhythm." Nothing more was needed. For the rest of August, Clara tended her studies yet surrendered her nights to the tower. Some evenings she merely sat in the chamber, letting the water music fold around her thoughts. Other times she penned small notations, heard grandfather's watch ticking in the hush, brought cedar shavings as thanks. Each visit closed the ledger line by line, sealing words into the Glen's quiet memoir. On the equinox, when early geese stitched wide verses across gray light, Clara prepared to leave. She entered the tower once more. The ledger waited open, new page unmarked. She wrote, visitor, none for now. Level, mirror, sky ready. A final drop rose from the glass and fused into the dial's grain. The amber glow softened to pale apricot, then faded altogether, as though the mechanism had folded into slumber until another seeker required its balance. At dawn she drove the winding road, mist unspooling behind her like thread from a calm loom. Passing the last glimpse of water, she noticed something. The pond reflected two skies, one dawn orange overhead and one slightly deeper blue beneath, layered as carefully as pages in a closed book. She felt no need to puzzle it out. Stillwater Glen would keep its own equations. Far off, perhaps in late hours she could no longer measure, the wooden dial surely resumed its turn, water and time whispering through cedar veins. And somewhere in the ledger a blank line waited, poised between mirror and sky, listening for the next quiet name to complete the pond's gentle arithmetic. A hush the color of twilight settled over Greystone Orchard, as though the evening itself had paused to listen for a forgotten note. The orchard lay 2 miles north of Oxford, tucked behind low stone walls draped with moss and centuries of mild English rain. Travelers on the old coaching road glimpsed only tangled apple trees and the dark slate roof of a keeper's cottage. But villagers knew the air within the walls carried its own slow rhythm, whispering of harvest that never quite ended. Ruth Calder, a botanical illustrator recovering from a long illness, arrived in early May to rent the cottage and sketch the orchard's antique cultivars. Her doctor had prescribed quiet days and breathing room. Greystone promised both. A gravel path, veined with violets, led from the gate to the porch. Each step released a cool perfume of earth and blossom that seemed to drift upward rather than away. Ruth unpacked charcoals and notebooks, opened the windows and let silence deep inside. The previous caretaker had left a single instruction on a folded card atop the mantel: close the bells at violet hour. The phrase puzzled her. There were no bells in sight, only an empty hearth and a clock that ticked with the relaxed certainty of old oak. She spent daylight wandering between rows, sketching gnarled trunks furred with lichen, cataloging the pale green swell of unripe fruit. Birds called in soft question marks. Wind crossed every branch with a cautious hand. Yet each afternoon, when the sky tipped from blue to lilac and the sun's edge brushed the Cotswold hills, a faint chiming drifted through the trees. It was not the clear ring of metal on metal. It sounded more like glass humming when a fingertip circles the rim. 3 tones, then stillness. On her third evening, Ruth followed the sound. Dusk pooled between trunks, turning grass into velvet. She reached the orchard's heart and found a stone folly resembling a small, roofless chapel. Ivy braided the columns. Suspended from the archway hung 6 slender glass bells, each pale as river ice, strung on silver ribbon. They caught the last of the light and glimmered like captive dusk. No breeze stirred, yet one bell vibrated gently, releasing that round, thirsty note she had heard from afar. Ruth lifted a hand but stopped short of touch. The card's directive returned. Close the bells at violet hour. Close them? How? She glanced around and noticed a narrow wooden box resting on a low ledge. Inside lay 6 velvet pouches, deep plum in color, each stitched with the outline of an apple bough. Understanding moved through her like a calm breath. She slipped the first pouch over the humming bell. The tone softened, then ceased as if the bell had folded itself to rest. One by one she covered the remaining bells. When the last ribbon was stilled, dusk felt complete, no longer waiting for anything to end. She returned to the cottage where lamplight and a gentle fire settled her nerves. Sleep came easily, bearing quiet dreams of lilac skies that never darkened further. Morning revealed dew shining on spider silk, every droplet catching new sun. Ruth brewed tea and sketched until noon. But unease tugged at her edges. What purpose did the bells serve? Why must they be closed only at violet hour? She searched the cottage and found a slim journal slipped behind the clock. The cover, gray linen, bore the name Edmund Greystone, 1891. Entries spoke of an experiment, capturing twilight's resonance so the orchard would always ripen at its most forgiving moment. The bells, Edmund wrote, vibrated with the violet frequency, a narrow seam between light and dark that lulled fruit into lingering sweetness. Yet if left uncovered, the bells would continue to drink from evening, delaying night indefinitely. One must let darkness arrive, he concluded, else dawn forgets the way. That evening Ruth repeated her walk. Again at the precise flush of lilac, the bells sang. She hushed them with the pouches, then lingered, sensing gratitude in the cooling air. A nightjar called from somewhere beyond the wall. Twilight sighed and released its hold. Days slipped into a pattern as gentle as breath. Morning sketches, midday rest, evening bell tending. Each time she drew the velvet over glass, she felt her own restlessness quiet. Even her lungs, once tight with illness, opened as though learning from the orchard's patient exhale. On the 7th night clouds smothered sunset, smearing color into dull gray. The bells, however, thrummed more urgently, strings of pale light pulsing within the glass. Ruth hurried, yet with each pouch she slipped on, the remaining bells rang louder, resisting closure. The air tasted of distant thunder. She recalled Edmund's warning, "Let darkness arrive." She steadied her breath and whispered, "The night is welcome." The final bell calmed beneath her fingers, sound folding inward like petals at close of bloom. Rain fell, gentle as tears of relief. Water slid along ivy leaves, tapping the stone in soft applause. Ruth stayed until the bells were silent, the pouches dark spots against flickering lightning. When she reached the cottage, she found the mantel card damp with dew, new words inked beneath the first. "Let the bells open at blossom moon." She checked the journal. Near the back, a clipped newspaper report described a phenomenon. Every 3rd June, when the moon swells above Greystone, apple blossoms glow faintly in the dark as if remembering daylight. Edmund had theorized that reopening the bells on that night allowed moonlight to mingle with stored dusk, weaving sweetness into the coming harvest. The blossom moon would rise tomorrow. When the evening arrived, clouds cleared, revealing a silver coin balanced on dark branches. Ruth walked to the folly, removed each pouch. As the glass met open air, tones unfurled, not louder but richer, chords layered like dawn behind clouds. Pale radiance seeped from bell to branch, petals shimmered with pearly light. The orchard seemed to breathe twice, once with earth, once with sky. Ruth closed her eyes, feeling the frequency settle into her bones, a gentle calibration of heartbeat and hope. She left the bells open that night. Before sleep she noted in her sketchbook, "Dusk tends the breath, moonlight tends the marrow." She realized her own healing had synchronized with the bells' quiet ritual. Closing them welcomed rest, reopening invited light. Month by month the apples fattened, storing hints of lilac and silver in their skins. When Ruth finally packed to leave, she carried a basket for her doctor, fruit that tasted of calm evenings and patient moons. On the mantel she placed a fresh card, "Close the bells at violet hour, open at blossom moon." The orchard remembers. As she latched the gate, twilight brushed the sky with the softest trace of purple. One bell rang once, farewell rather than alarm. Ruth smiled, the sound settling behind her ribs like a small, steady star. Moonlight slipped through the cracked skylight like a pale quill poised above open parchment, and the old Briarwood library seemed to inhale the faint ink of night. Nestled on the edge of the Adirondack foothills, the building stood apart from the small town it served, tucked behind sugar maples whose branches crossed like quiet guardians. The lane that reached it curved gently, discouraging haste, and ended in a circle of gravel where visiting cars gathered a soft coat of silver dust before departing again. For nearly a century the library had opened from 10 until 6, Monday through Friday, and then yielded its hush to crickets and wind. Yet residents whispered that some evenings, long after lights were doused, one lamp relit itself in the archive room and pages turned with no visible hand. Children dared one another to peek through the high windows, but the distance, and perhaps a sense of courtesy, kept them away. In early November, Eleanor Hayes arrived from Albany to catalog a bequest of rare folios, her first assignment since a spell of convalescence. She carried the quiet of recovery within her, a measured stillness she hoped Briarwood might understand. Miss Lowell, the head librarian, greeted her with a smile that had the texture of worn silk and offered a small office under the eaves. "The workroom is yours as late as you like," she said, "though I advise locking up by dusk." The comment floated between hospitality and caution. Eleanor accepted it without question. Her days unfolded in comforting routine. She rose before dawn, walked the perimeter path where frost outlined every fallen leaf, and entered the archive as shafts of early light settled on cedar shelves. The folios themselves, botanical studies, travel journals, letters bound in faded green ribbon, released scents of bergamot, pine resin, and distant rains. She catalogued meticulously, but a slender ledger stitched in pale calfskin eluded any entry. Its pages were blank save for the watermark of an unfamiliar moon crest. Each time she set pen to it, the nib hesitated as though ink refused to claim the paper. On her 7th evening, dusk arrived with a hush deep enough to blur the boundary between inside and out. Miss Lowell had left early for a town meeting, leaving Eleanor alone with the building's wooden size. She meant to finish labeling herbarium plates, yet the calfskin ledger drew her attention. A thin beam of moonlight, filtering through the skylight, touched its cover precisely where the crest lay embossed. The silver outline brightened, and a single line of handwriting surfaced on the first page, delicate as frost on glass. Attendance recorded by lunar hour, do not disturb the silence between names. Eleanor blinked, half believing she had nodded into a dream. She brought the ledger under the desk lamp, but the ink retreated, leaving the page blank once more. A hush, deeper than the library's usual nighttime calm, settled over the archive. Then, from the floor below, came the muted click of a date stamp and the soft scrape of a return cart. She descended the rear staircase. The main reading room lay in low amber glow. One lamp burned beside the long oak table. Beside it stood a tall gentleman in charcoal overcoat, back turned, consulting the card catalog with unhurried grace. His movements bore the cadence of old manners, sleeves whispering against wool as he slid a drawer closed. Eleanor stepped onto the carpet, and though her footfall was slight, he spoke before she could announce herself. "There's room enough for two," he said, voice resonant yet calm, as though they were long acquainted. "The collection prefers gentle company." She found herself replying softly. "The library is closed." "Closed to daylight concerns, yes," he answered, lifting a card to the lamplight. "Open to its own hours afterward." He returned the card, then, with ceremonial care, signed a narrow slip of paper and tucked it into the drawer. The ledger lay open on the table, its moon crest glimmering faintly. Eleanor approached. The page now held names written in one column, times in another, each entry corresponding not to the clock on the wall but to the moon's progress across the sky. First crescent, meridian, waning third. Beside several names were tiny annotations. Sought forgotten verse, listened for rain in out-of-print travelogues, found the map he mislaid in 1904. She looked up. The gentleman had moved to the stacks. fingertips gliding along spines with paternal fondness. "You see," he said, eyes reflecting lamplight like quiet water, "books remember who loved them. At night they request reunion." A question formed, "Are you a librarian?" but felt too small. Instead she asked, "And if one signs but doesn't know what to seek?" "The moon will suggest," he said. "She keeps an index of half-spoken desires." He took a slim volume bound in indigo cloth, placed it on the table and inclined his head. The title read Tides and Temporary Shores, an atlas of vanishing islands. Eleanor opened to a plate depicting an island shaped like a teardrop, caption seen only when longing is strongest. She felt something within her stir, a memory of childhood evenings when she believed hidden lands emerged for the pure joy of being found. She signed the ledger. The ink dried instantly. A breeze, scented faintly of salt water, threaded through the room though every window was shut. Somewhere above, the skylight quivered as if thin waves lapped against it. Together they read in companionable silence. At intervals the gentleman turned pages of his own selection, a music folio annotated in copperplate. The hours unfolded without urgency, measured by the slow sweep of moonlight across ceiling beams. When the first pale blush of dawn slipped behind the drapes, he closed his book. "Until the next lunar hour," he murmured, placing the volume on the return cart. He donned his overcoat and before stepping into the dim corridor added, "Leave the ledger where it wishes to rest." His footsteps faded like a line of poetry remembered upon waking. Eleanor touched the moon crest. The ledger closed of its own accord, pages settling with the softness of wings. She replaced it in the glass cabinet, noting how the lock clicked gently as though satisfied. When Miss Lowell arrived at 7, Eleanor was brewing coffee in the staff nook. She almost spoke of the visitor, the ledger, the salt-scented breeze, yet the morning light, practical and bright, made the tale feel less like fact and more like a gift meant to be handled privately. The calfskin ledger remained closed until moonrise, waiting, patient as a shoreline at low tide. Eleanor stayed on well beyond her assignment. Some evenings she signed the ledger, some she merely walked among shelves listening for stories that hummed against the grain of oak. And in the town below, those who noticed her softened gaze after dusk simply assumed that Briarwood's quiet charm was doing its gentle work, never knowing that within the library's lunar hours, islands appeared, forgotten verses found their voice, and a ledger of moonlit attendants kept careful, luminous watch over every seeker who dared to open its waiting pages. Nobody could say when the tall grass first learned to sway in perfect rhythm with the hallway clock, yet on nights when the moon lifted over Lake Larkspur, the meadow around Willowmere Hall seemed to move as though listening for a chime that never quite arrived. The old estate rested on the Vermont shoreline where maples met water in quiet accord, and every path leading to its stone steps wore a hush strong enough to soften footfalls into memories rather than sounds. Willowmere had once hosted summer recitals, cellos murmuring beneath chandeliers, polite applause settling like dust, but decades slipped by, and melodies folded into cobwebs that clung to ceiling roses. Only one inhabitant remained now, Arthur Lee, a retired horologist whose gentle devotion to time had outlived the guests, the gardeners, even the family who'd first hired him to oversee their clocks. Early each dawn he walked the corridor connecting study to foyer, a brass key ring swaying lightly against his coat, testing the gears of every wall clock with patient fingers. Polished mahogany cases lined the passage like companions keeping watch. Their pendulums, shaped like quiet bells, moved in measured arcs that seemed almost contemplative. Yet there was one clock Arthur never touched. It stood alone at the far end of the gallery, encased in pale birch that caught morning light and turned it to silver. The grandfather's face bore no numerals, only faint etchings of willow leaves circling a single blue hand. Residents before him had called it the Larkspur Dial. Local legend, traded over tea in neighboring cottages, claimed the clock chimed only when the lake was calm enough to mirror the sky without a ripple, and when it chimed, something lost would find its way home. Arthur had never heard the sound himself, not once in 40 years. Still, his routine included pausing before the birch case, bowing his head as though greeting an elder whose language he could not speak. He suspected the mechanism, if there was one, had long ceased. Yet the blue hand moved, imperceptibly but inevitably, and each sunset he found it waiting just shy of the 12, as if hesitant to complete a circle. One September afternoon brought a coolness that tasted faintly of wood smoke. Arthur opened shutters to let the season breathe through the hall. Sunlight formed slender aisles between dust motes, and in those lovely aisles he sensed a difference, an angle of light he couldn't name, but felt across his shoulders like a question. He closed each shutter again, careful and calm, only to notice upon returning that the larkspur dial's blue hand now pointed exactly to the 12. No chime sounded. The corridor kept its hush. Yet beyond the window panes, the meadow grass had stilled, holding the moment so gently it seemed afraid to rustle even for wind. Arthur studied the clock's face, saw no tremor, heard no click, but something within the birch case seemed to draw breath. He leaned closer, detecting a faint scent of rain on stone, a scent impossible indoors. That evening, rather than retreat to his modest bedroom under the eaves, he prepared a chair in the gallery. He brewed chamomile, carried the cup to a small side table, and lit a single oil lamp in case dusk grew timid. Then he sat opposite the larkspur dial, the meadow's hush pressed to the windows, and waited. Hours elongated yet felt unburdened. The lamp flame dipped whenever the lake sent a sigh across the shoreboards. Sometime near midnight, when even the crickets quieted to a murmuring pulse, the blue hand twitched. A soft metallic hum rose within the birch, nothing abrupt, merely a thread of sound unwinding. Arthur exhaled, and at that gentle release the hum gathered warmth, swelling until it unfurled into a solitary chime. It was neither bright nor mournful. It carried the subdued tone of distant church bells heard through first snow. The sound drifted down the corridor and seeped beneath doors, resting on each clock face like morning dew. The moment the chime faded, a second sound arrived, delicate footsteps upon parquet flooring deep within the house. They paced slowly, thoughtfully, the way one walks through a space both remembered and unknown. Arthur stood but did not call out. He traced the steps by ear until they seemed to pause beside the grand staircase. In the subdued lamplight he saw her, a woman in a traveling coat, pearl gray, holding gloves she did not wear. Silver hair brushed her collar, but her bearing hinted at younger days spent in fluted concert halls. Her gaze swept the corridor with calm recognition, then settled on Arthur as though he were the awaited host rather than custodian. "No train runs this late," he whispered, the words more observation than question. "I didn't travel by rail," she replied, voice threaded with the softness of turning pages. "I followed a sound I knew once." Together they faced the larkspur dial. The blue hand remained at 12, yet the willow etchings glowed faintly as if moonlit from within. She stepped forward, removed a slender brass key from her coat pocket, and offered it to Arthur. Its bow shaped a willow leaf, twin to those etched on the dial. "My father left this," she said. "He wished the hall to welcome us home only when we were ready to listen again." Arthur accepted the key without surprise. He had tended countless locks, but this one felt different, lighter than brass, almost weightless. He opened the case, revealing gears of glass that caught lamplight and shimmered like water. In the heart of the mechanism rested an empty cradle, waiting. He placed the key there, and delicate springs inhaled. The blue hand moved forward, and a second chime, lower than the first, traveled through floor and stone, drifting outside to the lake where it rippled the surface into rings that glimmered under the moon. From the shore, lanterns began to appear, carried by villagers who sensed the long silent bell. Feet padded across dew-cooled grass. Voices hushed in wonder. An unspoken invitation drew them nearer, yet no one crossed the threshold. They simply watched as light awakened in high windows, one by one, as though the house were remembering its own rooms. Inside, Arthur turned to the woman. "Will you stay?" "I believe the hall asked the same," she answered, eyes misted with tired gratitude. She set her gloves on the chair, the gesture small but decisive, and together they listened to distant clocks reset themselves, gears slipping into newfound ease. Outside, the meadow resumed its gentle sway, no longer bound to unanswered longing. The ripples upon Lake Larkspur widened, then settled, mirroring stars so clearly that the night seemed deeper yet kinder. And within Willowmere Hall, the Larkspur dial kept time not for departure, but for arrival, its chime now a promise that whatever drifted away might someday return, unhurried and whole when the hour, and the listener, were quiet enough to receive it. A lone glow wavered across the Connecticut salt grass, as though a small star had paused mid-journey and chosen to hover just above the marsh. Iselin was scarcely a village. 3 cedar houses, an aging boathouse, and the decommissioned lighthouse that once guarded the Long Island Sound. The lantern at its peak had been dark for 20 years, yet local fishermen swore that on windless nights a single light drifted out from the tower, crossing the waterlogged reeds before vanishing where the tidal creek met open sea. Elias Vaughn arrived in early September to catalog shorebirds for a conservation trust. He rented the caretaker's cottage beside the shuttered lighthouse, happy to trade city sirens for cricket pulse. The trust supplied a skiff, a notebook, and quiet instructions. Mind the tides, note the herons, ignore the stories. Elias intended to do exactly that. Days fell into gentle rhythm. Dawn painted the salt hay silver, plovers darted at his boots, gulls wheeled above mudflats that smelled of brine and sun-warmed rope. Each afternoon he climbed the lighthouse stair to map nests on the lantern gallery. The interior smelled of rust and old kerosene, wood swelled by years of fog. The lens, once polished to star-like clarity, stood veiled beneath canvas. He never lifted the cloth. The tower felt like an elder resting, and he respected its sleep. One dusk, while recording the soft clack of willets, Elias saw the glow for himself. It appeared at ground level, not high in the lantern room. A palm-sized flame, steady despite the breeze. It glided along a narrow plank path half submerged in eelgrass, pause by pause, as if consulting a map older than the marsh itself. Elias followed at a respectful distance, binoculars lowered to avoid the impression of scrutiny. The light reached the water's edge and quietly extinguished, leaving only the scent of extinguished wick and something older, maybe lavender, maybe memory. Inside the cottage that night, pages of data felt suddenly thin. Sleep came in fitful pockets, punctuated by the imagined hiss of a lamp being trimmed. At midnight a soft rattle at the back door woke him fully. He opened it to empty night, yet on the step rested a folded scrap of linen around a brass key, seawater beating on both. The key's bow formed a perfect circle, engraved with 3 letters, ICL, Iselin Coast Light. Morning sun dismissed the mystery with practical brightness, but curiosity stayed. Elias climbed the tower, key in pocket. Halfway up, he noticed a small iron hatch flush with a brick, its lock rusted but intact. The key slid in smoothly, turning without protest. Inside lay a narrow chamber no wider than a closet, walls lined with shallow shelves. On each shelf rested a lantern, dozens of them, each glass polished, each reservoir filled. Wicks looked freshly trimmed. Yet there was no scent of oil, only a clean hint of salt and fir. A leather-spine notebook lay open on a central stand. Its pages listed dates and tides, moon phases, names of storms. One entry stood alone at the bottom. Lanterns walked, August 18th, full tide. The handwriting felt deliberate, loops careful, as if penned by someone accustomed to coaxing flame rather than ink. Elias added the previous night's date and noted lantern walked, ebb tide. He closed the book, pulse calm despite the oddness. The room's hush encouraged trust over alarm. Evenings grew earlier. Each twilight the marsh exhaled cool vapor that blurred horizons into watercolor grays. Some nights the light appeared, some nights not. When it did, Elias followed at a distance, memorizing its route. Always the same plank path, always the same hush at the creek mouth. He began to wonder if the lantern marked a changing depth, a warning invisible to satellite charts yet crucial to hidden currents. A nor'easter arrived, pressing slate clouds low over the sound. Wind scratched the shutter boards. Rain etched quicksilver diagonals across the pane. At dusk a glow flared within the tower gallery, brighter than any he had seen outside. Elias scaled the spiral steps, lantern from the secret room in hand. The canvas over the great lens billowed as though breathing. He peeled it back. Glass facets caught storm-dim light and spun it into muted rainbows. A panel on the pedestal lay ajar, revealing a chamber just wide enough to cradle the brass lantern he carried. The fit was perfect, as if engineered for that single piece. When he placed the lantern inside, the wick bloomed cobalt, silent yet certain. Outside, the storm's howl softened to a deep-throated hush. Through the gallery glass he saw the marsh lanterns, every single one from the hidden room, floating outward in slow procession, tracing luminous lines along flooded channels. Their reflections braided with rain-shaken water, creating corridors of calm. Wind leaned back, puzzled. Waves settled into gentle heaves. Elias watched until the final flame reached the sea and dimmed beneath the storm-churned horizon. Then he returned the great lens to darkness, replaced the canvas, and descended, carrying only the faint smell of newborn smoke on his sweater. Morning broke clear. Newspapers spoke of severe weather turned mild without explanation. Fishermen, mooring lines still taut from precaution, found their channels untouched by surge. Mrs. Grant, from the nearest house, brought Elias coffee cake and confided that her grandmother once served as lighthouse keeper when men were away at war. She said the marsh keeps its own watch, the woman smiled, provided someone remembers to polish the glass. Elias said nothing of keys or secret shells. He simply accepted the cake and later opened the notebook in the hidden room, writing, "Lanterns walked, storm tide, duty fulfilled." Below, space waited for another line, blank yet anticipatory, like a quiet shoreline expecting moonrise. When his assignment ended, he left the key on the cottage table beneath a note. Data logged, birds counted, lens resting. If the lantern walks, follow with calm heart. At the edge of the property he glanced back. Sunlight struck a single gallery pane, kindling a brief, warm shimmer. The calm heartbeat of a watch resumed. Elias drove away content, knowing the marsh did not need him to stay, it only needed witness. And somewhere, folded inside reeds where salt meets fresh, a lantern's memory drifted, ready to rise whenever clouds gathered, carrying a promise that in Iselin, even silence keeps alight. The museum's night watchman had been making his rounds for 30 years, though he had been dead for 15 of them. Detective Lisa Morgan discovered this impossibility while investigating a series of minor thefts at the Riverside Museum of Natural History. The stolen items were curious in their insignificance: a Victorian microscope missing a lens, a collection of pressed flowers with half the specimens removed, fragments of pottery from an otherwise intact display. The thefts occurred despite the museum's sophisticated security system and the presence of Walter Kowalski, the night watchman who had guarded the building since 1978. Walter was a fixture at the museum, a quiet man in his 70s who took pride in knowing every exhibit, every artifact, every shadow cast by the building's skylights on moonlit nights. Lisa first met Walter during her initial visit to the museum. She found him in the paleontology wing at 3 in the morning, making his methodical rounds with a small flashlight and a clipboard where he noted the time and location of each security check. "Terrible business, these thefts," Walter said, his voice carrying the slight accent of someone who had emigrated from Eastern Europe decades earlier. "In all my years here, we've never had troubles like this." Walter appeared to be exactly what the museum director had described, a dedicated employee who treated the building and its contents as if they were his own family heirlooms. He moved through the galleries with the careful familiarity of long practice, checking locks, adjusting thermostats, ensuring that the precious collections remained safe through the vulnerable hours of darkness. "How long have you been working here, Walter?" Lisa asked as they walked through the mineral exhibition. 31 years come December," he replied, pausing to straighten the information placard that had been knocked slightly askew. "Started just before Christmas 1978. Mr. Patterson hired me himself, God rest his soul." Lisa made a note to verify Walter's employment records, though she had no particular reason to doubt his story. He seemed like exactly the sort of employee museums treasured, reliable, knowledgeable, and possessed of the kind of protective instinct that treated every artifact as irreplaceable. The thefts continued despite increased patrols and additional security cameras. What puzzled Lisa most was the complete absence of the thieves on any surveillance footage. The cameras showed Walter making his regular rounds, but never captured any unauthorized presence in the building. More strangely, Walter himself never appeared on the newer digital security cameras, though he was clearly visible to Lisa and other museum staff members. The older analog system recorded him without problem, but any camera installed after 2008 showed only empty corridors during the hours when Walter claimed to be patrolling. Lisa began to investigate Walter's background more thoroughly. The employment records at the museum confirmed his hire date and showed consistent performance reviews over 3 decades. But when she contacted the Social Security Administration, she discovered that Walter Kowalski had died in 2008, the same year the museum had upgraded its security system. According to the death certificate, Walter had suffered a heart attack while on duty, found the next morning in the museum's Egyptian collection where he had collapsed during his final rounds. When Lisa returned to the museum that night, she found Walter in his usual place, beginning his methodical patrol of the galleries. He greeted her with the same courteous professionalism he had shown during their previous encounters. "Walter," she said carefully, "I need to ask you about your employment status here." He paused in his examination of a display case lock, looking at her with mild curiosity. "My employment status? I'm not sure what you mean, detective. When did you last speak with the museum director about your job?" Walter considered this question with the same careful attention he gave to his security checks. "Well, I don't see Mr. Patterson much anymore. The new director, Miss Chen, she works during the day. We pass each other sometimes when I'm finishing my shift." Lisa realized that Walter genuinely believed he was still employed, still making his necessary rounds. Death had not interrupted his sense of duty or his deep connection to the museum's collections. "The thefts, Walter. Do you have any theories about who might be taking things?" Walter's expression grew troubled. "That's what puzzles me most. I know every inch of this building, every sound it makes at night. I would notice if someone was moving through the galleries who shouldn't be here." Lisa began to understand that the thefts might be connected not to an outside intruder, but to Walter himself. Perhaps his protective instincts had evolved into something more complex, driving him to relocate items he felt were particularly vulnerable or precious. She started tracking the stolen objects more carefully and discovered a pattern. Each missing item had been scheduled for transfer to storage or loaned to other institutions. The Victorian microscope was being decommissioned due to damage. The pressed flowers were being removed from display for conservation work. The pottery fragments belonged to a collection that was being reorganized. Lisa found the missing artifacts in Walter's security office, carefully arranged in a cabinet that appeared only during the night hours. Each object was labeled with a note explaining why it needed protection. "Too fragile for storage, should not be separated from collection. Mr. Patterson would want this displayed." "Walter," Lisa said gently when she discovered his secret preservation project, "these items need to be returned. The museum staff knows how to care for them properly." Walter looked at the cabinet with obvious distress. "But they're changing everything, detective. Moving pieces, storing things away. This museum is losing its soul." Lisa spent the rest of that night talking with Walter about the nature of museums, how they must evolve to continue serving their mission of education and preservation. She helped him understand that change could coexist with respect for the past, that proper conservation sometimes required difficult decisions. Lisa never saw Walter again, though the museum staff reported that the night shift felt different afterward. Less watched, somehow, but also less protected. The theft stopped completely, and the building settled into a new rhythm of security that relied entirely on electronic systems and human guards who cast shadows on the cameras that recorded them. Sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, the current security staff reported hearing footsteps in empty corridors and the soft click of a flashlight being turned on and off. But these sounds carried no menace, only the echo of eternal vigilance keeping watch over treasures that deserved protection, whether the guardian walked among the living or had moved beyond such distinctions. The Highland platform, half hidden by broom and heather, had not seen a scheduled arrival for 30 years, yet its timber beams still smelled of creosote and distant journeys. Wind slipped through broken panes in the signal box, carrying peat smoke from scattered crofts and the low murmur of the nearby lock. On most nights only owls kept watch, but tonight an archivist named Nora Dewar stepped from a modest hire car, her breath hanging pale in the lantern glow. She had driven north at the request of the Rail Heritage Trust, tasked with surveying line records rumored to remain in the old parcel office. The work sounded straightforward, yet the letter hinted at something quieter. Unsent dispatches, perhaps, or manifests written in a hand no one could place. Nora enjoyed such gentle puzzles. She fetched her satchel, locked the car, and followed a gravel path softened by moss toward the waiting room door. The door yielded with a civilized sigh. Dust and cold greeted her, not brusquely but with the steady patience of places and used to company. She set her lantern on the ticket ledge, its mellow light revealing benches scarred by initials, a schedule board frozen on 1947 Inverness, and a brass bell labeled Ring for Porter that retained a faint, expectant shine. Beyond an archway the parcel office waited, shut by a sliding hatch. Nora stepped through. The wooden floor flexed once, then settled. She slid the hatch upward. Stale air drifted out, tinged with cedar and faint engine oil. Stacked crates lined the walls, each stenciled with dates ending in 1953, yet the ledger on the counter bore entries well into the 1970s. She ran a finger along the columns. Names of villages long since unserved appeared beside precise weights and times of dispatch. Each entry ended with a small circle drawn in red ink, delicate, almost ornamental. A soft vibration caught her attention, barely more than a rumor of sound, from beyond a narrow corridor at the back. She listened, but nothing followed, only the wind tracing eaves. She jotted a note, then opened the nearest crate. Inside lay parcels wrapped in brown paper, tied with cotton twine, addresses lettered in a graceful, looping style. The string had not frayed, the paper not yellowed, as though packed that very morning. She lifted one addressed simply to Mrs. I. McLeod, Platform Cottage, though no cottage stood within miles. She set the parcel back, respectful, and moved toward the corridor. It led to a short flight of steps descending beneath the station, likely to the ammunition store repurposed during the war. The air grew cooler, more mineral with each tread. Her lantern painted gentle crescents along curved walls until she reached a chamber about the size of a garden shed. Shelves lined three sides, yet only one item rested there. A brass pocket watch, lid open, hands halted at 2:14. Beneath it lay a folded timetable printed on silk, the fabric so thin the lantern light passed through, illuminating ghostly lines of type. She read the header aloud, Night Freight 414, effective only under new moon. The sheet listed 3 stops, Glenraig, Kelda Ferry, and a final destination simply noted as return. No dates, no years. She refolded the timetable with care, slipped it into her satchel, and examined the watch again. The second hand, though motionless, looked poised to start at any moment, like a held breath. From above came the faintest tremor, a muted rustle of gravel as though boots crossed the platform. Nora extinguished her lantern on instinct, letting darkness settle. In that hush, a distant whistle floated through the stone like a memory recalled, thin and perfectly pitched. It did not startle her. Instead, it felt curiously reassuring, the way a lullaby might pass through a door half closed. She waited, counting heartbeats until the sound ebbed, then lit the lantern once more. Returning upstairs, she found the parcel office unchanged. Yet the ledger now lay open to a fresh page. Ink, still glistening, spelled her own name beside the red circle, and the doer, 2:14. The pen rested exactly where the signature ended. She felt no alarm, only a settling certainty that someone, or something, kept precise accounts here, indifferent to ordinary calendars. She closed the ledger gently, traced the circle with a fingertip, and looked toward the platform. Moonlight revealed rails rusted but intact, stretching north into a shadowed cutting. Beyond, the lock's surface shone pewter, unruffled. She stepped outside, letting the door fall silent behind her, and walked the length of the platform, lantern low. A faint smell of steam drifted on the air, though the night remained cool and engines silent. Near the signal box, a telegraph key, long frozen, caught the lantern light. She touched it. The lever moved with surprising ease, clicking once, then settling. At that instant the rails vibrated, subtle, like catgut under a bough. Nora stood still, balanced between questions and calm. The vibration grew neither louder nor fainter, simply present, steady. She understood then that the station's task had never ceased. It had merely slowed its breathing, waiting for someone willing to listen. She returned to the waiting room, closed the parcel office hatch, and wrote a brief note for the trust. Records intact, parcels undisturbed, operations ongoing. She hesitated over the last word, then left it. On the ticket ledge she placed the pocket watch, lid open, so that any who entered might notice the hands resting at 2:14. The lantern she extinguished, allowing starlight to drape the benches in soft silver. Outside, her car waited, engine still warm from the drive. She did not turn the key immediately. Instead, she sat with windows down, hearing wind, water, and, only once, the faint chords of a diesel horn carried from somewhere beyond the ridge. It lingered, then faded like a story told just past waking. She smiled, started the engine, and eased the car back onto the single-track road, leaving Glenraig to its measured night. Behind her, the station lights, never wired to electricity, glimmered for a brief moment, as though a train had indeed pulled in and opened its doors. Then the glow receded, returning the platform to shadow and the ledger to its silent arithmetic. Nora drove on, feeling unhurried, sustained by an inexplicable certainty. Some journeys run best when timetables drift, and some packages arrive precisely when the world is most ready to receive them. The Garden Keeper's Secret. The roses in Whitmore Estate's abandoned garden bloomed in December, their petals untouched by frost. Emma Patterson discovered this impossibility during her first winter as caretaker of the property. The estate had been empty for 3 years, ever since the last member of the Whitmore family had passed away. Emma's job was simple: maintain the basic structure, ensure the pipes didn't freeze, and prepare the property for eventual sale. The garden lay behind the main house, enclosed by high brick walls that had been built in the Victorian era. Emma had avoided it during her first months on the property. The space felt too intimate, too personal to disturb. But when December brought its first hard freeze, curiosity drew her to the garden's wrought iron gate. Inside, she found a wonderland that defied the season. Roses climbed the brick walls in impossible abundance. Their blooms were perfect, deep red, soft pink, creamy white, as if summer had taken refuge in this single sheltered space. Emma walked the gravel paths in amazement. Not only were the roses blooming, they were meticulously maintained. Someone had been pruning, weeding, and caring for this garden despite the estate's abandonment. She found him on her third visit to the garden. An elderly man knelt beside a rose bed, working compost into the soil with the careful attention of a practiced gardener. He wore a worn tweed jacket and canvas gloves, and his silver hair was neatly combed despite the morning's work. "Good morning," Emma called softly, not wanting to startle him. The man looked up with mild blue eyes and a gentle smile. "Ah, you must be the new caretaker. I'm Arthur Henley. I hope you don't mind my being here." Emma stepped closer, noting the quality of his work. The rose beds were immaculate, the paths swept clean, every plant showing signs of expert care. "I don't mind at all, but I'm curious. How long have you been tending this garden?" Arthur sat back on his heels, considering the question. "Oh, 40 years or so. Started when I was head gardener for old Mr. Whitmore. Seemed ashamed to let it all go to ruin after he passed." "The family never mentioned a gardener," Emma said carefully. "Are you sure it's all right for you to be here?" "The Whitmores were always very kind to me," Arthur replied, returning his attention to the soil. "I like to think they wouldn't mind me keeping things tidy." Emma left Arthur to his work, but the encounter puzzled her. If he had been the estate's gardener, surely his continued presence would have been mentioned in the property management documents. She made a note to contact the lawyers handling the estate. The law firm's response was prompt and slightly impatient. There was no record of an Arthur Henley ever being employed at Whitmore Estate. No arrangements had been made for garden maintenance. The family had specifically requested that the grounds be left unattended until the sale was finalized. When Emma returned to the garden the next morning, she found Arthur deadheading roses with a pair of silver secateurs that caught the weak winter sunlight. "Arthur," she said gently, "I need to ask you about your arrangement with the Whitmore family." He paused in his work, studying a particularly fine bloom before carefully cutting it and laying it in a wicker basket beside him. "I started working here in 1962, he said slowly. Young Mr. Edward had just inherited the property from his father. I was 23, fresh out of horticultural college. Edward gave me free rein with this garden. Said it was his mother's favorite place, and he wanted it to stay beautiful in her memory." Arthur's eyes grew distant, focused on something beyond the garden walls. Edward's wife, Patricia, loved the roses too. She would bring her tea out here every afternoon, sit on the bench by the fountain. After she died, Edward stopped visiting the garden. But he asked me to keep it going. For her sake, he said. Emma listened, calculating dates in her head. If Arthur had started working here in 1962 at age 23, he would now be in his 80s. That seemed plausible, though he moved with the vigor of a much younger man. "And after Edward passed away?" she asked. "Well, the garden still needed tending, didn't it?" Arthur smiled, returning to his roses. "The roses don't know their gardener is gone. They still need pruning, feeding, protection from pests. It wouldn't be right to abandon them." Over the following weeks, Emma found herself looking forward to her visits with Arthur. He was a fountain of knowledge about horticulture, sharing techniques he had learned over decades of careful observation. He spoke of the garden's history with intimate familiarity, describing renovations and plantings that had occurred long before Emma was born. She began to research the estate's history more thoroughly. In old photographs from the local historical society, she found images of the garden in its prime. And there, in a 1963 photograph labeled "Head Gardener with Prize-Winning Roses," was a young man who looked remarkably like Arthur. The resemblance was unmistakable, but something nagged at Emma's mind. She studied the photograph more carefully, then compared it to her memory of Arthur as she had seen him that morning. The young man in the photograph and the elderly gentleman in the garden looked not just similar, but identical in every detail except age. Emma's unease grew when she realized that Arthur never seemed to arrive at or leave the garden. He was simply there each morning when she visited, and gone by evening when she locked the estate's gates. She began varying her schedule, arriving at different times, but the pattern held. Arthur existed only within the garden's walls, only during the daylight hours when the roses needed tending. One February morning, Emma found a leather-bound journal left on the garden bench. The pages were filled with careful records of plantings, weather observations, and seasonal maintenance notes, all written in a neat, old-fashioned hand. The entries spanned decades, documenting the garden's evolution from the 1960s through the previous week. The final entry, dated the day before, read simply, "The new caretaker understands the importance of this place. The roses will be safe in her care. The garden chooses its own guardians, and it has chosen well." Emma never saw Arthur again, but the roses continued to bloom through that winter and into spring. When the estate was finally sold to a young family who promised to restore the gardens, Emma felt a deep sense of satisfaction. On her last day as caretaker, she sat on the bench where Patricia Whitmore had once enjoyed her afternoon tea. The roses nodded in the gentle breeze, their blooms perfect and eternal. And Emma could have sworn she heard, carried on the wind, the soft sound of someone humming an old gardening song while tending to flowers that would bloom forever in the memory of love. The village of St. Roch lay folded among low Provençal hills, its stone lanes warmed by centuries of sun, yet tonight a muted coolness drifted in from the fields. Shadows lengthened across shuttered cottages, carrying the faint scent of crushed thyme. Above the tiled roofs, the abandoned Monastère de Trois Sources rose like a pale memory, arches silvered by moon-ready light. Although the monks had departed decades ago, travelers still spoke of quiet footprints and candle-glow glimpsed through broken cloisters when evening settled. Émile Durant arrived on foot, coat brushed with road dust, carrying a leather folio and a single fountain pen. The village mayor had written him with polite urgency. Lost hymnals had surfaced in the monastery library, pages fragile as moth wings, and required a careful hand. Émile agreed, drawn by the chance to listen for echoes in forgotten halls. He found lodging above the bakery where warm bread cooled on wide oak boards. Madame Lavelle offered him lavender tea, then pointed toward the hillside path. "Go before full dark," she murmured. The stones dream more softly then. He started at twilight, feet crunching along a chalky track lit by dusky gold. Crickets kept a measured cadence, leaving ample space between their songs. Midway, a small spring bubbled beside a fig tree, its water clear, its voice subdued as though reciting prayers. Emile paused, knelt, and touched the surface. The ripples traveled outward in perfect circles, slow, deliberate, like breath before sleep. The monastery gate, wrought iron faded to moss green, stood slightly ajar. A sigh of wind moved through, lifting a dry leaf that spiraled upward, then settled again. Inside, the main courtyard opened wide to the sky. Cloister arches framed pockets of shadow where vines climbed with patient insistence. Marble benches lined the walk, edges worn smooth by silent congregations of time. Somewhere deeper, a single bird called once, a soft note, then fell still. Emile's lantern cast amber ovals along the flagstones. He followed the corridor toward the scriptorium, guided by memory of monastic plans he had studied in dusty archives. Doors hung open on silent hinges, revealing small cells, each furnished only by stone slab beds and the lingering odor of beeswax. He reached the library without misstep. There, tall windows admitted violet twilight, brushing shelves that held fewer volumes than he expected. A long reading table occupied the center, its surface clean but for a stack of loose parchment bound by twine. He set the lantern down, its glow settling like calm water. Untying the stack, he discovered not hymnals but delicately inked maps of underground channels, annotated in Latin and Old Provençal. Margins bore faint music notes, neumes drifting between coordinates. Beneath each map lay a sheet of vellum embossed with 3 words, always the same, sub aqua sonnet. Beneath the water it sounds. Emile traced a fingertip across the phrase, savoring the smoothness. Somewhere nearby, a drop of water fell, quiet and sure as though agreeing. He looked up. No rain leaked through the tiled roof. Another droplet answered from deeper within the stacks, then another, marking an unhurried tempo. He followed. The droplets led him to a narrow stair descending beneath the library. Cool air met him, scented faintly of river stone. He descended, counting each shallow step, until the passage opened into a circular chamber carved directly into bedrock. The lantern glow revealed a shallow pool at the center, its surface unbroken, reflecting the low arched ceiling. Around the pool, inscriptions spiraled outward, lines of chant etched in patient hands. The first words mirrored those on the vellum, sub aqua sonnet. He knelt at the edge. The water was clear, holding the ceiling's reflection with tranquil loyalty. Then, almost imperceptibly, a murmur rose, soft, resonant, neither word nor melody, more vibration than voice. It reminded Emile of a tuning fork held beside the ear, a hum that asked nothing yet lingered. The sound grew by half a breath, then receded, leaving silence even gentler than before. He did not attempt to scoop the water. Instead, he spoke a single greeting in Latin, a courtesy to whatever memory lingered here. The pool answered with 3 concentric ripples that rolled outward, then vanished. On instinct, Emile opened his folio, drew a fresh sheet, and transcribed the moment. 2117, first resonance beneath the library. Echo resembles low D, sustained. The act felt less like recording data and more like adding a verse to an endless, unseen hymn. Time thinned. Lantern light softened, its flame dipping but steady. Emile listened for further notes, yet the chamber held its peace. He took that stillness as permission to depart, folding the maps and vellum with meticulous care. The stair welcomed him upward, each step returning him to the hushed library, then the cloister, now bathed in muted moonlight. Crickets had slowed their cadence, leaving longer pauses as though hearing what he had heard. Back in the courtyard, Emile lingered by the central fountain long run dry. He imagined water once singing here too, multiplying the hidden chant beneath the library. The quiet held him easily, like deep blankets on a cool night. He whispered thanks, though unsure to whom, and retraced his path to the gate. Descending the hillside, he felt no urge to rush. Around him, olive trees stood silver under the moon, leaves trembling with mild breeze. Each footstep stirred faint dust, rising then settling, a gentle punctuation. By the time he reached the bakery, the village slept. Even the ovens cooled, their heat folded into crusts awaiting dawn. In his small room, Emil set the folded maps on the bedside table. He left the window ajar, allowing the night air, and perhaps a distant, submerged chord, to drift through. Before extinguishing his lamp, he added one final note to his journal. The monastery keeps its choir, though the mouths are water and stone. I was merely audience. Lying back, he felt the hush of Saint Roche settle around him, steady, composed. Somewhere beneath the hills, a deep note might have thrummed again, but if so, it joined his dreaming, cradling him toward sleep with the promise that some mysteries prefer to remain half-heard, half-sung, forever carrying their gentle resonance just below the surface of the world. The music began exactly at midnight, drifting through the stone corridors like a memory made audible. Dr. Helena Voss first heard it on her third night working alone in the Bodleian Library's restricted archives. She had taken the position in Oxford to catalogue a recently donated collection of medieval manuscripts. The work required after-hours access when the main library was closed and the ancient building settled into its nighttime stillness. The melody was faint but unmistakable. A single voice, unaccompanied, singing what sounded like a medieval plain chant. The notes seemed to echo from somewhere deep within the building's maze of storage rooms and forgotten chambers. Helena paused in her work, listening. The voice was beautiful but melancholy, carrying words in a language she couldn't identify. After several minutes, the singing faded away, leaving only the familiar whisper of the heating system and the distant sound of Oxford's late-night traffic. She mentioned the music to Dr. Pemberton, the head archivist, the following morning. He looked puzzled, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses in the way he did when confronted with something unexpected. Music? At midnight? He considered this carefully. These old buildings do strange things with sound. Pipes settling, wind in the ventilation systems. The acoustics can play tricks. But Helena knew the difference between mechanical sounds and human voice. The melody had been too pure, too intentional to be anything but deliberate music. The singing returned the next night. This time, Helena left her workstation to investigate. She followed the sound through corridors lined with centuries-old books, past reading rooms where scholars had pondered manuscripts by candlelight long before electricity illuminated their work. The voice seemed to move through the building like a ghost, always just ahead of her footsteps. When she paused to listen more carefully, it would fade. When she resumed walking, it would return, leading her deeper into sections of the library she hadn't yet explored. Helena found herself in a circular room she had never seen before. Ancient wooden shelves curved along the walls, filled with manuscripts bound in cracked leather and vellum. In the center of the room stood a single desk with a green-shaded lamp that cast a pool of warm light on its surface. The singing stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, Helena noticed that the manuscripts surrounding her were all musical notation. Medieval chants, Renaissance madrigals, compositions and systems of notation she had only read about in academic papers. On the central desk lay an open manuscript. The pages were cream-colored vellum, covered with musical notes drawn in faded brown ink. At the top of the page, written in elegant Latin script, were the words Cantus Memoriae, Song of Memory. Helena approached the desk carefully. The manuscript was clearly medieval, possibly 13th century. The musical notation was beautifully illuminated with tiny painted flowers and birds that seemed to dance between the staff lines. But what struck her most was the condition of the pages. Despite their apparent age, they showed no signs of deterioration. No foxing, no brittle edges, no fading of the illuminations. She photographed several pages with her phone, intending to research the piece later. But when she reviewed the images the next morning, they showed only blank vellum. No musical notation. No illuminated decorations. Nothing. Helena returned to the circular room the following night. This time she brought proper archival photography equipment. But when she reached the place where the room should have been, she found only a storage closet filled with cleaning supplies. She spent hours retracing her steps, exploring every corridor and chamber she could access. The circular music room had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. The midnight singing continued night after night. Helena began to recognize recurring melodic phrases, patterns that suggested this was not random vocalization but a complete, structured composition. She started bringing a small recorder to work, hoping to capture the music for analysis. The device picked up only silence, even when the singing was clear and distinct to her ears. Helena delved into the history of the Bodleian Library, searching for any reference to musical manuscripts or mysterious phenomena. In a 19th century librarian's journal, she found a curious entry. The night music continues to perplex. Brother Thomas insists he hears plainchant in the early hours, always the same melody. I have searched every chamber and found no source. Perhaps the stones themselves remember the prayers once sung within these walls. Further research revealed that parts of the library had been built on the foundations of a medieval monastery. The monks of St. Bartholomew had been known for their musical scholarship and had maintained one of England's finest collections of sacred music before the dissolution. Helena began to understand that she might be hearing not present music, but musical memory embedded in the very stones of the building. The voice that sang each midnight belonged to no living person, but to the accumulated echo of centuries of devotional song. On her final night in the archives, Helena completed her cataloging work early and sat quietly in the main reading room, waiting for midnight. When the familiar voice began its nightly song, she didn't try to follow it or record it. Instead, she simply listened. The melody was heartbreaking in its beauty, carrying within its notes all the longing and faith of voices long silenced. It spoke of dedication to something larger than individual existence, of the human need to create beauty even in isolation, of the way music could bridge the gap between the living and the dead. As the song faded with the approach of dawn, Helena whispered a quiet thank you to the darkness. Some gifts, she had learned, were meant to be received rather than captured. Some mysteries were more beautiful when left unsolved. The music stopped after that night. But sometimes, when Helena worked late in other libraries and archives around the world, she would pause in her cataloging and listen carefully to the silence. And occasionally, very occasionally, she would catch the faintest echo of that midnight voice, singing its eternal song of memory through the patient stones of ancient buildings. Along the main coastline, the wind already carried a hint of frost, yet the salt air remained mild enough to smooth every sound, rounding corners, gentling edges. The town, a scatter of clapboard houses and shuttered shops, seemed to lean inward as though listening to the hush between waves. From the platform, Clara Devreux lifted her luggage, one battered valise, and drew in the quiet, tasting pine resin and distant seaweed. She had come to catalog the papers of the late lighthouse keeper, an uncle she scarcely remembered, but she suspected the true work would prove less tangible. A single street lamp guided her through narrow lanes toward Pelican Cove. Windows glimmered faintly behind lace curtains, each house breathing its own muted warmth. Yet no door opened, no voice called, and the hush felt deliberate, like a pause in an unfinished conversation. At the water's edge, the lighthouse stood apart on its granite ledge, tall, pale, and unlit since the keeper's passing. Waves combed the rocks with patient persistence, revealing smooth channels worn by decades of tides. Clara crossed the small footbridge linking shore to island. Boards creaked softly under her steps, echoing across black water. She recalled childhood letters from her uncle, always composed in neat block script, describing shifts of starlight, the hum of lantern gears, and, more obscurely, the murmuring lights that visit after midnight. At 10 she'd found such phrasing entrancing. At 32 she found it faintly melancholy. Inside the keeper's cottage, oil lamps waited trimmed and ready, as if someone anticipated her arrival. Dust lay thin, disturbed only by a faint trail leading from doorway to desk. She followed it, touching the back of a seagrass chair. A ledger rested open on the blotter, ink still black, the final entry dated 3 nights before her uncle's death. One sentence ran beneath a small, precise sketch of the lighthouse lens. The second note drifted again at half-tide, carrying the same 3 words. Nothing else. Clara pressed 2 fingers to the paper, feeling the ghost of the penstroke. The room's stillness deepened. Through the window, the lighthouse tower loomed, a silent silhouette against dim constellations. Somewhere beyond, a foghorn from the mainland moaned, long, low, lingering, then fell quiet, leaving the cottage wrapped in its own small night. She unpacked only a shawl and her notebook, then set water to boil on the old iron stove. Flame hissed softly, granting the air a faint metallic warmth. While she waited, she explored the shelves that lined the walls. Charts, tide tables, and slender field journals sat ordered by year. In each, the handwriting matched the concise style she remembered, but the margins told another story, pencil notations that read more like dream fragments than navigation aids, soft footsteps beneath the waves, color that tastes of iron, a voice asks to be answered. Tea steep. Steam curled beside her face, carrying bergamot and an underlying mineral tang from the well. She listened to the lighthouse, an act of memory not of sound, and wondered at her uncle's solitude. Sitting, she leafed through one journal dated February. Midway she found an envelope, edges worn, addressed simply, "To the next watcher." Inside lay a narrow strip of parchment bearing a code of dots and dashes, unmistakably Morse. She traced the sequence with a pencil, translating aloud in a near whisper, "Stand at dawn. Listen for the third." The words sent a calm ripple through her. They did not feel ominous. Instead, they resembled an invitation extended across time. She folded the message and slipped it into her pocket. The kettle clicked, flames subsided, and outside, the tide reversed its pull. Sleep came lightly on the cot beside the desk. She drifted in and out, lulled by the sea's slow respirations. Somewhere near dawn, a faint tapping stirred her, the delicate arrhythmic patter of a telegraph key. Eyes half open, she realized the sound came not from any device but from the tower itself, each tap spaced by the hush of water folding back onto sand. Rising, she wrapped the shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch. Gray pre-dawn bleached the horizon. The bridge glimmered with dew, narrow planks shining like bone. She crossed without hurry, letting tide-cooled mist brush her skin. At the tower's base, iron stairs spiraled upward, each rung worn smooth by generations of keepers. She climbed, counting heartbeats instead of steps, until she emerged into the lantern room. The great lens, motionless, caught the first ghost of daylight, scattering soft prisms along the glass walls. Dust motes drifted in gentle currents. Then, from somewhere deeper in the iron ribs, the tapping resumed. 3 slow knocks, a pause, 3 again. Clara traced the source to a brass service panel. It bore a hatch secured only by a single screw, half loosened. She removed it easily, revealing a hollow compartment. Inside lay a small glass bottle sealed with wax. Within the bottle floated a folded ribbon of sea green paper. She withdrew it, fingertips tingling. When unrolled, the ribbon revealed 3 words in her uncle's crisp hand: "Return the echo." Clara inhaled the salt air, steady and patient. Below, the tide reached its quietest moment, neither rising nor falling, the world caught in a held breath. She laid the ribbon flat on the narrow sill and waited. Around her, gulls remained silent, ships invisible. Only the hush of light through glass kept company. Then, somewhere just beyond the breakwater, a different tapping echoed back. 3 crisp beats, a pause, 3 more, carried over water like polite conversation. The sound was subtle, almost coy, as though confirming her presence. Without fully understanding why, Clara felt a smile rise. She reached for the telegraph key mounted near the lens. A relic still wired to nothing, pressed it gently and tapped 3 measured strokes in reply. Silence followed, but it was a living silence, full of promise. The horizon brightened, soft pink staining low clouds. Within the tower, calm settled like a shawl across her shoulders, as though the lighthouse itself sighed in relief. Whatever mystery linked the taps, the bottle, and her uncle's final notes was not demanding solution. It merely asked continuation. She, the next watcher, had answered. The sun edged above the sea, gilding foam and rock. Light touched the lens, sending warm bands across the cabin. Clara folded the sea green ribbon, placed it back inside the bottle, and returned the bottle to the hollow compartment. The hatch closed with a gentle click, a punctuation mark, not an ending. She descended the spiral, step by unhurried step, and crossed the footbridge as the town behind her stirred awake. A gull cried once, then fell quiet. In the cottage she set fresh pages on the desk and began a new ledger, first entry written in steady script. At dawn, the conversation resumed. She paused, listening. Outside, the sea kept its measured rhythm, unhurried, unconcerned. And Winterport, still holding more questions than answers, eased into morning with a calm that asked only to be heard. The antique map showed streets that had never been built and a river that had changed its course 50 years too soon. Professor Julia Brennan found the map in a collection donated to the University of Vermont's Geography Department. It was beautifully drawn on heavy parchment, depicting the town of Millbrook, Vermont, in exquisite detail. The cartographer's signature in the lower right corner read M. Thorne, 1952. What puzzled Julia was the map's impossible accuracy about things that hadn't yet happened. It showed the bypass highway that wasn't built until 1967. It depicted the shopping center constructed in the 1980s. Most remarkably, it showed the Millbrook River following a channel it had only carved after the Great Flood of 1978. Julia had been researching historical cartography for her dissertation on how maps reflect both geography and aspiration. This particular map seemed to document not the past, but somehow, impossibly, the future. She drove to Millbrook on a gray October afternoon to investigate. The town sat nestled in a valley between gentle hills, its main street lined with maple trees that had turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson. It was exactly as depicted on the mysterious map, down to the smallest details. At the Millbrook Historical Society, Julia met Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, a woman in her 70s whose family had lived in the area for generations. Thorne? Mrs. Whitman repeated, adjusting her reading glasses to examine the map Julia had brought. Oh my, yes. That would be Margaret Thorne. She was quite the local character. Spent most of her life drawing maps of places around here. Can you tell me about her? Mrs. Whitman led Julia to a display case in the corner of the small museum. Inside were several maps, all bearing the same signature and displaying the same impossible prescience about future developments. Margaret was born here in 1923, Mrs. Whitman explained. Her father was a surveyor and she learned the trade from him. But Margaret's maps were unusual. She would spend weeks walking every inch of the area she was documenting. People said she could sense things about the land that others couldn't see. Julia examined the maps in the display case. Each one showed a different area of Vermont, and each contained details that shouldn't have existed when it was drawn. A map dated 1954 showed ski trails that weren't cut until the 1960s. Another from 1948 depicted a lake that was created by a dam built in the 1950s. Did anyone ever ask her how she knew these things would be built? Mrs. Whitman smiled, the expression carrying decades of fond memory. Oh, people asked. Margaret would just say she drew what the land wanted to become. She claimed she could see the potential in every hill and valley, every bend in the river. Is she still alive? Margaret passed away in 1985, but she left quite a collection of maps. Her daughter Caroline inherited them all. Julia felt a flutter of excitement. Does Caroline still live in the area? She does indeed. Lives in her mother's old house up on Birch Hill Road. Though I should warn you, Caroline is, well, she's continued her mother's work in her own way. The drive to Birch Hill took Julia through countryside that seemed suspended in eternal autumn. The leaves had reached that perfect moment of color that comes just before they begin to fall. Margaret Thorne's house sat at the end of a gravel driveway, a Victorian cottage surrounded by gardens that looked as carefully planned as any map. Caroline Thorne was a woman in her 50s with her mother's keen eyes and careful manner. She invited Julia in for tea and listened to her questions with the patient attention of someone accustomed to inquiries about her family's unusual legacy. People have always been curious about Mother's maps, Caroline said, serving tea from a delicate china service. Cartographers, historians, land developers who wanted to know how she predicted where roads would be built. And what did you tell them? Caroline moved to a large oak cabinet and withdrew a leather portfolio. I told them the same thing Mother told me. She didn't predict the future. She read the landscape. Caroline opened the portfolio to reveal dozens of maps, each one a masterpiece of detail and impossible foresight. Julia saw town squares that existed only as vacant lots when the maps were drawn, bridges that spanned rivers at precisely the points where they would eventually be built. Mother taught me that land has memory and intention, Caroline explained. Rivers remember their old channels even after they've been diverted. Hills remember the paths that people and animals naturally want to take. If you know how to look, you can see where things want to be built. Caroline pulled out a map that was clearly recent, drawn in the same careful style as her mother's work but showing contemporary Millbrook with additions that didn't yet exist. "I've continued the tradition," she said simply. "This map shows Millbrook as it will be in 10 years. The town council doesn't know it yet, but they'll want to build a new library right here." She pointed to a carefully drawn building on a lot that currently stood empty. Julia studied the map with fascination and growing unease. "How can you know that?" "The same way Mother knew. I walk the land. I listen to what it tells me. Every place has a destiny, Professor Brennan. Some people build against that destiny and struggle. Others learn to work with it and find that their projects succeed beyond their wildest hopes." Caroline returned the maps to their portfolio with careful reverence. "Mother always said that the best maps don't just show where things are. They show where things belong." As Julia drove back to Burlington that evening, she found herself looking at the landscape with new eyes. She noticed the way valleys seemed to channel traffic toward natural crossing points. She observed how hilltops invited the placement of houses and how rivers carved paths that seemed to anticipate the bridges that would eventually span them. When she returned to her research, Julia approached her dissertation with a different perspective. She began to write about maps not as static documents of what exists, but as conversations between human intention and the subtle preferences of the land itself. And sometimes, late at night when she was working on her research, Julia would think about Margaret and Caroline Thorne walking the hills and valleys of Vermont, reading the landscape like a book written in a language only they could understand, drawing maps that showed not what was, but what was always meant to be.